like 80, 70, 80. Mic check, 1, 2. Mic check for the reporter. Test 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Mic check, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Witness mic check, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Mic check. You good, Sherry? Mic check, 1, 2, 1, 2.
Members' Day. This Select Committee is focused on ensuring Congress can fulfill the most important and essential role described under Article 1 of the Constitution, the power of the purse. Long before our committee was formed in February, there was bipartisan agreement throughout the Capitol and across the country that the current process for completing this basic function of government is in need of substantial improvement. That agreement led to bipartisan, bicameral support for the creation of this panel as part of the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018. This committee of 16 members has already spent a lot of time building consensus on some of the problems and conducted 3 previous hearings to consider solutions. Today's hearing gives members who know that budget and appropriations reform is necessary the opportunity to participate in this essential work. This hearing is meant to engage all members of Congress from both sides of the aisle and both ends of the Capitol and solicit their ideas for possible reforms to improve the current process. We believe doing so is key to our continued efforts and eventual success. I'm encouraged by the level of interest and participation from those testifying in person and those submitting statements for the committee's consideration. We are grateful for your input and your ideas. We are particularly excited to welcome some of the House leadership, Speaker Paul Ryan, Democrat Leader Nancy Pelosi, and House Democrat Whip Steny Hoyer. Thank all of you for being here. And thank you to everyone for joining us and offering your valuable perspective. We are eager to hear your ideas. And with that, I want to yield to my friend and co-chair, the gentlelady from New York, Nita Loy.
Well, thank you, and welcome to our Members' Day hearing, where we'll hear from members of the House and Senate about what should be done to improve the way Congress handles budget and appropriations matters. There's no shortage of complaints about the budget process. Budget resolutions are often adopted late or not at all. Budget rules are routinely waived. All too often, appropriation bills don't get enacted until the fiscal year is well underway, creating major uncertainties and problems, and appropriation bills get encumbered with all sorts of extraneous legislative riders, which contributes to the controversies and delays. Changes to the budget process might help reduce some of these problems, and that is our task here. For example, we need to find a way to get agreement on appropriations top lines early in the year so that the appropriators can get to work filling in the details. We need to find a better way to deal with the debt ceiling, a law that serves no useful purpose but invites brinksmanship that threatens our nation's credit rating and the health of our economy. And we need to find a way to make our budget resolutions more effective tools for formulating and carrying out budget decisions. But there are also limits on what can be accomplished with rules changes. Flawed rules and procedures aren't the root cause of much of what people complain about in budgeting. Rather, the root cause often lies in deep divisions over policy, combined with misplaced priorities, partisanship, and polarization. We need to find ways of alleviating those as well. It's gratifying and encouraging to see the number of members participating in this hearing, and we're particularly honored to have with us the Speaker of the House, as well as the Democratic leader and the Democratic whip. I look forward to everyone's testimony. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Ms. Lowy. With several members testifying today, we have a long morning ahead of us. Therefore, before we begin, I'd like to inform members that we plan to take a brief recess at about 10:30 this morning so that you can check email, make phone calls, and take a comfort break. As a reminder, members will have 5 minutes to give their oral testimony, and their written statements will be submitted for the record. Additionally, members of the committee will be permitted to question the witnesses following their statements, but out of consideration for our colleagues' time and to expedite today's proceedings, I'd ask that you keep your comments very brief. I'd like now to recognize our first witness of the day, the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan from Wisconsin. We appreciate your time today. It is no surprise to anybody on this panel or those watching that you have an interest in this process. that you, perhaps more than any person on Capitol Hill and indeed throughout the nation, know more about this process and about the budget and appropriations process than virtually anybody. So your testimony is critical to the outcome that this committee will achieve sometime later this year. We have received your written statement. It will be part of the formal record. You have 5 minutes to deliver your oral remarks, and the floor is yours, Mr. Speaker, with our thanks for being here.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I've never actually had my remarks ever time limited since I've had this job, so this is going to be a challenge here.
Yeah, no magic minutes around here.
Exactly. So, first of all, it's a wonderful to be here. I can't tell you how excited I am about the fact that this committee exists. Obviously, I had a big hand in making sure that this occurred. I want to thank you, co-chairs, Lowy and Womack, for doing this work. I am going to stick with some of my written testimony, then I'm going to go off the cuff. As you know, I chaired the Budget Committee, chaired the Ways and Means Committee. I've spent basically my adult life working within the 1974 Budget Act and the budget process. So I have a great deal of background in this area. And I think that this panel is so urgent at this time. As things stand, I think we are basically falling well short of our tasks. We continue to fail the taxpayer. Worse, we continue to set ourselves up for failure with the way the budget process works these days. And it is obviously, clearly, time for a new approach. And I think I can feel comfortable speaking on behalf of Republicans and Democrats in saying that. So because I have this background, I just want to basically give you a sense of my perspective on this. Whenever there's a new speaker, there's hope for a new process. Members clamor for more influence and more input. I experienced that. I came in not running up the leadership ladder, but up the committee chair ladder, wanting to decentralize power in this place, empowering the members. I've got to say, the way this budget process works effectively is it centralizes power too much in this institution. We do not have a decentralized power structure here. We have a centralized power structure here that is not fair to members of Congress, their constituents, and the taxpayers. So the way I look at this, the budget and appropriations process, it starts with good intentions. It has a good foundation. You have a tight timeline. Even under the best circumstances, that tight timeline leaves no room for detours. Invariably, what happens now is the process seizes up, and not long after, the whole thing falls apart. And as the clock ticks down, final decisions are kicked up to leadership, and that kicks back a final product that members find unsatisfactory. And we sit in these rooms, the four corners, so to speak, and look over $1.3 trillion, for example, and make decisions that ought to be made by the members who spend all of their time on the committees, doing the research, doing the oversight. They're the ones who should be making these decisions. So we do not have a functional process, and the power is too concentrated. So I would even say calling this organized chaos is too generous a description. And so, to me, all of these omnibuses and these continuing resolutions, they're a little more than local anesthetics. It's like an anesthesia, but the pain goes away, but the problem doesn't go away. And it just feeds on itself, fueling pessimism on all sides. Members become less engaged, the public becomes more disenchanted, and with each of these stumbles, with each new year, we're handing over more spending decisions to the executive branch. So I see this as a squandering of our institutional duties of oversight. I see this of squandering the talent we have among our members on the committees of jurisdiction, like the Appropriations Committee. And more fundamentally, it's an abdication of our critical power of the purse for the legislative branch of government. So I'm one of those people who's I see the glass of life as half full. I'm an unapologetic optimist. And I do believe we can solve tough problems, even this one. And that's why I'm encouraged at what you're doing here. The reforms that we need, I think, are bold, but I think they're right in front of us. I think some of the ideas we've been talking about for years, they're ready. They're time to do it. And, the way I look at this thing is we may not be able to change the deadlines, but we can change the calendar. Look at what we're doing right now and look at the entire appropriations process. How many of you, and I ask senators here, I see, just a couple, how many of you think the Senate is ever going to, again, do 12 appropriation bills, separate appropriation bills, 12 conference reports before the fiscal year. Not going to happen. Let's just get on with acknowledging that and come up with a process so we actually go back to regular order on appropriations. And this is why I ultimately think the best idea of all the ones that we've been looking at, and I've done hearing after hearing after hearing, 8 years at the Budget Committee as either ranking member or chairman, Ways and Means chair. I think biennial budgeting is the smartest way to go. And I think biennial budgeting has great bipartisan roots. So it, to me, offers a path to rewriting the process, not just reforming it. It makes budgeting an ongoing process instead of all these demoralizing fits and starts that we have. It brings renewed transparency and accountability, and it sets us up to be better stewards of taxpayer dollars. There are a lot of different proposals I've seen on biennial budgeting. I myself have introduced multiple Congresses the Biennial Budgeting and Enhanced Oversight Act. I think the recent and this really takes a lot of Senate involvement. The recent proposal by Chairman Enzi makes a lot of sense to me. Do 6 appropriation bills one year, 6 appropriation bills the next year. So you're appropriating every year, and you're doing it in a workload that is doable. And you have biennial budgeting on top of that with reconciliation instructions. And I think it's not too much to ask for the way the Senate works to do 6 this year and then 6 the next year. That, to me, is probably one of the best ideas I have seen. I don't think this violates any partisan issue. This isn't an ideological thing. This is just how can Congress work better. The way I look at this, if properly implemented, this will empower members to do a deeper dive on the most troublesome issues, and it will enhance their ability to oversee the executive branch. I think it will reinvigorate member participation. It will encourage actual conference committees and actual conference reports on individual appropriation bills. And I think it will also enhance the importance of reconciliation. In 2013, Patty Murray and I got together as budget chair, and she was as budget chairs, and we put together a 2-year deal. Then John Boehner and President Obama put together a 2-year deal. Then we just recently put together a 2-year cap deal. So we have sort of demonstrated that we can put together 2-year deals, 2-year spending cap deals that work, but now we want to have, I think, an appropriations process that follows that kind of a track. So the way I look at these things is take a look at the record we have. I'm just going to read from my notes here. The last fall, the House passed all 12 appropriation bills on time. This is the first time the House has done that since 2009. The last time the House and the Senate passed all 12 appropriation bills on time was in 1994. So 12% of the current members were here for that. I was a think tank staffer at the time. 12% of the people in the House were here the last time we passed all 12 appropriation bills. So we have an entire generation of people's representatives have become accustomed to, if not acclimated to, a failed budget process. So we have basically taken this failed budget process as just the way things work, and there's nothing you can do about it. Let's reject that kind of thinking. Let's reinvigorate a budget process, and I'm just simply giving you a suggestion as a person who's observed this process for many, many years. And if this body comes together and presents a plan for reinvigorating the budget process, I really believe we can get buy-in. And I like to think that the members of Congress who have known nothing but budget dysfunction would love and welcome the day and the opportunity to actually have a reinvigorated, workable, practical budget process where every member of Congress has more franchise, more influence, more say-so, and that means the taxpayer is going to be more respected at the end of the day. So I really believe, as a person who fought to create this committee in the last omnibus appropriations bill, I think that you have a great opportunity in front of you. I think a lot of these ideas are bipartisan. In the old days, as in like 10 years ago, it used to be appropriators against budgeteers or against authorizers. This doesn't have to be the case. This does not have to be appropriators versus other committees, because the appropriators themselves are losing their ability to affect change. When we do these omnibus appropriation bills, we are taking the pen away from the appropriators and writing these bills with just a few people. By having a biennial process with 6 bills, the appropriators write those bills. The appropriators go to conference committee. you have a budget process that is more likely to be adhered to. And so that, to me, seems like one of the sweet spots we could have with a bipartisan, bicameral compromise to make this budget process work. And I simply submit this for your consideration, and I hope you really come up with something that we can take and be proud of and restore this branch's power of the purse. And with that, thank you very much.
We appreciate your comments this morning, Mr. Speaker. To be respectful of your time, do you have a couple of minutes in the event that any of our members would like to ask a question? The Chair would recognize anyone that might have a question for the Speaker this morning. Anyone? Senator Bennett.
I just would ask for your impression about what has caused the centralization that you described. Why have so many members of Congress yielded to so few the decisions that are made around here about budgeting and, sort of made themselves props in somebody else's play?
Yeah, it's a good question. So a House guy could easily go beat up the Senate for having cloture and motions to proceed and all of the rest of that, but I will resist the temptation. I think it is easier to push decisions elsewhere and not own the consequences. I think if we have a structure that that has a chance of passing, I think people gave up on thinking the appropriation process works. I think people gave up thinking we're going to do 12 bills. Well, first of all, think of the calendar. You get the president's budget in March, then you have a statutory deadline by April 15th to pass a budget resolution, which gives you the budget instructions, the 302As, which then the committee goes and writes the Bs. And then you may start your appropriations process, hopefully as early as May, but probably not till June. And you've got to get 12 appropriation bills done through the House and the Senate conference before September 30th. So the thing backs up and it just doesn't work. And so most members just don't think it's going to happen. So they don't invest themselves into participating in a process that's going to yield results because they just know the calendar just doesn't work. So that's why I believe if you have a biennial budget with the caps already sort of preordained, every 2 years you rewrite those caps, I would encourage annual reconciliation, but you have an appropriations process that can start earlier and you have half as many bills to do, I believe members will have more faith and confidence that they can actually get the work done. So they'll actually participate and get involved in actually getting a good product. Because what invariably happens is we do a CR to buy us a little more time, and then we have the appropriators kind of write their bills and move it up, and then it comes to, the Speaker, the Minority Leader, the Majority Leader, and the Minority Leader in the Senate, and then we put together some massive bill. That is not a good way to run government. The power is too, I'm the person who gets the power, I don't want it. It's too concentrated. It is not how government should work, because the person who is the chairman and ranking member of the Energy and Water Committee are spending time after time in hearings, reading GAO reports, listening to inspector generals. They know their jurisdiction better than anybody else. They know how these bills should be written. They know how taxpayer dollars are being guarded or not, and they should write the bills, not somebody who's juggling every other thing in Congress. That, to me, is the breakdown in the process. And by having the executive branch come to an appropriations committee where they know that that committee is going to be writing their bill, I think the executive branch is going to be far more responsive to the legislative branch and the power of the purse, because they know it's not going to be some omnibus. They know it's going to be that person I'm looking at across the rostrum is going to be writing my appropriations bill. I think they're going to make our government far more responsive and accountable if that is the case.
Once again, Speaker, we appreciate you being here, and again, to be respectful of your time. I know you have other appointments to deal with. Your insight is valuable, and we appreciate the fact that you led on getting this Joint Select Committee established and charging us with the responsibility of coming to a solution. I want to say something very quickly, Ms. Lowy.
I want to thank you also, Mr. Speaker, because I really think if we can talk through these issues, hopefully we'll make major changes in the process. But I want to emphasize one point again, and I mentioned it in my opening statement. In my judgment, the root causes often lie in deep divisions over policy combined with misplaced priorities, partisanship, and polarization. And as an example, I just recently met with Senator Shelby, and it hasn't been completed, but they are working together swimmingly. No poison pills. They're moving through the process, getting ready to bring the bills to the floor. Now, I agree the process isn't over, but compare that with the House and the process. We all work together, but each of our bills are loaded with poison pills. So I just put that out there because there's a real contrast now on appropriations, the way the Senate is operating, working together, and we all like each other, but our bill in the House are loaded with poison pills. So that's something that we really have to think about.
Well, I won't do much of a retort other than I'm expecting a big bipartisan vote on the defense appropriation bill this week. We had bipartisan support, not as much as we would have liked on the 3 appropriation bills we already passed a couple of weeks ago. But you're right, we're going to have differences of opinions on these things. Labor age is a perfect example. But let's have it on its own. Let's have those fights. Let's have those votes. Let's have those amendments. Let's have those conference committees. That's the way the process should work. And again, Ms. Lowy, you're constricting the process if we just say, this isn't going to happen, let's just kick it all upstairs, let's just put it in a big omni and have a bill that's this big, that spends this much. That is not good government, no matter how we disagree on individual riders.
Perhaps we can talk again another time.
All right.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
for appearing before
Thank you.
us.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm now pleased to welcome our next witness, the distinguished leader of the House Minority, gentlelady from California, Nancy Pelosi. Welcome, Madam Leader, and we are going to give the floor to you, and then we will be respectful also of your time in potential Q&A. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Madam Chair. Thank you to members of the committee from both sides of the House. I'm very encouraged by the fact that this discussion is taking place. I think it's very important and long overdue. I do believe that a budget should be a statement of our national values. What's important to us as a nation should be how we allocate our resources, and that budget process that we're engaged in should be something that is respected as we go forward into the appropriations process. I have a different view on some of these subjects than the Speaker because I come here as a long-time appropriator. I've heard the perspective of a Ways and Means committee person, but I do believe that 1 year, 2 years for the budget, 1 year for the appropriations legislation is the appropriate route to go. It was music to my ears to hear the Speaker say that he didn't think we should have legislation on appropriations bills. Of course, that is what upsets the apple cart and all the smooth workings of the Appropriations Committee. I have always said, left to their own devices, the appropriators, in a bipartisan way, know how to allocate resources, respect each other's points of view, and can come to a balance that is important for the Congress. It is when the legislating on appropriations bills that enters into it, which started so in the late 90s. I don't say that you never should have one piece of legislation or appropriation bill. You shouldn't have it unless there's bipartisan agreement that for whatever reason this engine is leaving the station in the national interest, we need to move something immediately on a must-pass, must-sign bill. But that is not what is happening in this case. And that, in my tenure on appropriations, which has gone way back, was what made the difference between a smooth running of appropriations, instituting the budget agreement or not. The Speaker said very eloquently that people on these committees know their brief. The oversight responsibilities in the Appropriations Committee, and left again to its own devices, I think it could do a very good job. So a few principles I want to put forth. First, I do believe that when we have sent members to any of the discussions on budget, we just say, be agnostic. Just go into that room, put growth in the middle of the table, and say what will promote growth, create good-paying jobs, and reduce the deficit. Those are our standards. We don't give you any assignment to say, do this, do that. Growth, good-paying jobs, reduce the deficit. I do think that we should return in that light to a pay-as-you-go budgeting, which Republicans have abandoned in favor of creating huge deficits and then using those deficits for another purpose, cutting Medicare and Medicare Social Security. I'll get to that in a moment. Second, we should amend the reconciliation process so it never is used to increase the deficit. So it's never used to increase the deficit in the budget window. And third, Republicans, we should do no harm to, none of us should do harm to the process. We must pass constitutional amendment, not pass constitutional amendments or implement capped limits on mandatory spending, and we must stop using the budget resolution as a messaging document to call for unspecified and unrealistic spending cuts not included in the reconciliation instruction. I don't want to waste your time. I'm being very direct in what I am recommending. We hear people blaming Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security for the record deficits and debt levels, but the driver of simple demographics, not extravagant spending. For example, I think it's important as we go forward that we note the reality of the demographics. We reduce the replacement rate in Social Security with the average retiree benefit is only $1,400 a month. Medicare does not cover vision, dental, or hearing benefits, does not have an out-of-pocket limit. Most of the elderly has a form of supplemental coverage costing around $150 a month. So it's not about extravagance on that end. Medicaid is by far the least generous initiative in terms of reimbursing providers. The elderly population, now this is the demographic issue, the elderly population will double between 2010 and 2035. The elderly population, increasing from 40 million to 80 million people, from 13% of the population to 20% of the population. In fact, demographics account for 80% of the increase in outlays for these initiatives from fiscal year 2018 to 2028. I'm sticking to my notes on some of this in the interest of time, because I could go on. In light of these demographic shifts, we need to work on a bipartisan basis to reduce health spending. We are proud of what we did in the Affordable Care Act, slowing the annual Medicare spending program per capita from 2.3% in the 5 years prior to the enactment of ACA to a negative 0.3% in the years since enactment. We must build on that progress through the far stronger reforms than those proposed by the Trump administration. We need to allow Medicare Part D. We've been trying to do this for years. We need to allow Medicare Part D to negotiate lower drug prices, push payments and delivery reform through Medicare and Medicaid Innovation Center, and work toward paying for value rather than volume of health services. This should not be a partisan debate. Hardworking families across the country cannot afford the skyrocketing cost of health care today. When we passed the Affordable Care Act, in terms of budgeting, if everybody loved their health care and their health insurance, we still had to do it because of cost. Cost to the individual, cost to small business, cost to corporate America, cost to the public sector. We simply could not afford the escalating rate of increase. We, as I said before, reduced that, but the cost of prescription drug is still the biggest obstacle to leveling all of that. So to return to responsible budgeting, I encourage Congress to move toward the 2-year budget agreement. I agree with the Speaker on that. Maintain annual appropriations. I agree with Congresswoman Lowy on that. And do not adopt automatic continuing resolutions. Imagine that we had 5 CRs between last year and when we passed our omnibus. We must make it easier to pass debt limit increases. That shouldn't be taking up time, debate, and leverage. Members have attempted to hold the country's credit hostage to individual demands, risking grave consequences for our economy and our country and our credit rating. Even when we didn't do it, just talking about it lowered our credit rating. We should urge the Senate to adopt the Gephardt rule. Gephardt rule enabled us just to go through that, as the Constitution says, the full faith and credit of the United States is not in doubt. Just have it go through. So we take that off the table. While some pay lip service to the principle of fiscal responsibility, We have fought to put our fiscal house in order. I'm very proud that in the 90s, President Clinton put us on a trajectory of job growth. We come back to that job growth and smaller deficits despite inheriting a massive deficit. The last 4 Clinton budgets were in surplus or in balance. President Clinton handed President Bush a projected $5.6 trillion 10-year budget surplus. But when you do away with the pay-as-you-go, that surplus was squandered again with massive tax cuts for the wealthy that did not. 2 unpaid-for wars, not negotiating for Medicare prescription drugs, all of that, according to the CBO, is what added to the deficit. The tax cuts and spending sprees exploded the deficit, plus a new $5 trillion. That's an $11 trillion turnaround. We went from $5 trillion plus on a path to reducing the debt to $5 trillion additional debt, $11 trillion turnaround. We cannot, fiscal recklessness cannot continue. Passing a tax scam for the rich, I'll express my disagreement with that, has increased the deficit, and it has not. It's increased the deficit, and it's going to be at the expense of Medicare, Medicaid, et cetera. When the President took office, he said the current services projection of deficit over the period for fiscal year 2018 to 2027 was $9.4 trillion. Now, due to the Republican tax bill, the CBO's latest current services projection for those same year is over $2.3 trillion larger. You just can't continue with that to a staggering. The reckless giveaways have exploded the projections of the annual average deficit to 8.4% of GDP. The deficit, not the debt, the deficit to 8.4% of GDP. So in this, where we find common ground, 2-year budgeting. What I would advocate as an appropriator, very important, to have 1 year, the annual appropriations bills. What I think is problematic to that is the massive legislation, sometimes in the form of poison pills, that are being placed on these bills. It almost makes us want to make everybody be a member of the Appropriations Committee. It's no use for other committees to exist because we can just pile it on the Appropriations Committee, and in a way that is not bipartisan. I don't think either party should do it. So members of Congress must honor our responsibility to make smart investments, promote growth, create good-paying jobs, reduce the deficit, and do so in a way that keeps the deficit under 3% of GDP when the economy is healthy, while driving strong, again, sustainable growth. I thank you for your attention to this important issue. I hope that, just looking at this committee, I think that there's real opportunity for you to do something that will make more efficient, more predictable, more timely the process. But again, it's all about our values, what is important to us as a nation. We have sufficient time in our committees of jurisdiction authorization to debate the policy. That shouldn't be something that is placed, appropriating is policy making in itself. There's enough going on there. But to use the appropriations process as a vehicle for poison pills and partisan policy making, it just discredits the responsibility that we all have. When I was a little girl, my father was a member of the Appropriations Committee. He would talk in his political speeches in Baltimore about the almighty powerful Appropriations Committee. As a very little girl, not even in grade school yet, it would, to me, almighty powerful. That was only identified in one way, in a heavenly way, and now he was attributing it to the Appropriations Committee. Let's have the Appropriations Committee retain its power, assume no more, and be responsive to a responsible bipartisan budget resolution. Thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you. Again, it's no use our wasting each time. I thought I'd get right to some clarity of thinking on my part to propose.
We truly appreciate your insight here this morning. Does the gentlelady have time for maybe a question or
Sure.
a comment or two? Does
If
anybody
anybody has one.
on the committee have a question or wish to make a comment? Hearing none?
Thank you for
Thank
your
you very much
leadership
for
and
your
your
time
good
this
work,
morning.
and good luck in your deliberations. Hopefully, a nice bipartisan advance into the cause will spring from your good work. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
At this time, we'll welcome our next witness. He is the Democrat whip in the House, gentleman from Maryland, Steny Hoyer. Mr. Hoyer, we appreciate the opportunity to hear from you this morning. We will hear your testimony, and then if time permits, may have a question or two. The floor is yours, sir.
Now it's on. That's assuming, of course, you want to hear me. Thank you very much for welcoming me, Chairman Womack and Co-Chair Lowy. Appreciate very much this opportunity to share my thoughts with the Joint Select Committee on the Budget and Appropriations Process Reform. In context, I served actively on the Appropriations Committee for 23 years. Obviously, I'm on leave for some years now. In the few minutes I have, Mr. Chairman, I want to talk about three important areas where reform ought to occur. The first is congressionally directed spending. Now, this may not sound like some great reform issue to people, but as somebody who served on the Appropriations Committee, I see it as a critically important connection to my district, that I can respond to the needs of my district, which I believe I know as well as any other person, and certainly any other person in the executive department. Members of Congress know their districts, as I said, better than any one of the federal agencies and better than the Appropriations Committee as a whole. When Republicans came into the House majority in 2011, they made a mistake by eliminating congressionally directed spending through changes in their conference rules. Unfortunately, they also changed the Gephardt rule. My own view, Mr. Chairman, is the debt limit ought to be eliminated. It is a phony issue. It lends itself to gamesmanship and brinksmanship, which is harmful to our country and not honest with the American people. They both gave up Congress's constitutional power of the purse to the executive branch and made it more difficult to forge consensus in major legislation. It's true that some members abused the process in the past. That's why when Democrats came into the majority in 2007, we reformed the process to make it transparent and to hold all members accountable by showing the public which members sponsored each item, requiring members to certify they had no financial interest and published all requests on their websites and blocking for-profit entities from receiving them. This committee should consider bringing back congressionally directed spending, at a minimum, with the Democrats' successful reforms and others to make it more transparent if you thought that was necessary. The second area, Mr. Chairman, I want to address is paying for what Congress buys. The problem is not spending, the problem is not taxing, the problem is paying for what we buy. That is the discipline in the system. And to the extent that we allow ourselves to simply borrow to buy what we want to buy, that discipline disappears. I would suggest to you it also has disappeared in tax cuts. To give a $1.5 trillion headroom is simply to give additional debt credence. If you had to pay for that, if you had to offset it by spending cuts, either to mandatory or to discretionary spending, that would be discipline in the system. But we have eliminated the discipline in the system. This Congress has ignored the statutory pay-go rule law that Democrats enacted in 2010, and the current House majority replaced the effectively House pay-go rule. I would suggest to you when we were operating on the pay-go, we balanced the budget. We balanced the budget because, frankly, Republicans limited spending. Clinton wouldn't allow tax cuts, and the economy exploded. Those three things are why we balanced the budget 4 years in a row. The House Republican alternative of cut-go only deals with spending, which left the door open for this majority to pass a tax law that raised deficits by $1.8 trillion last December, and trillions more over the period it has been a House rule. PAYGO deals with both spending and revenues in a balanced way. To pretend that it is only spending and not the cut in revenues that puts you in the hole is dishonest. This allows Congress full flexibility to make our collective political decisions as to the best mix of policies to offset the cost of any new legislation. Third, any budget process will only be successful if there is the political will to follow it. Pretending that process will solve this problem is a delusion. The current process has been effective when Congress chose to pursue it. If the Budget Committee were allowed to do its job and did it honestly and responsibly, and not simply as a political message, no party is immune from passing budgets that are simply and solely political messages without relevance to reality. It would be the legislative branch's loudest voice in setting overall long-term fiscal policy if we would be honest. Too often in recent years, the Budget Committee has been sidelined, only called upon when the majority decided reconciliation instructions were necessary to force through partisan legislation. Last year's tax law was a perfect example of abusing the budget process by using a tool intended for deficit reduction, ironically to be one of the largest deficit increases that I have voted on in my 37 years in the Congress of the United States. Mr. Chairman and Madam Co-Chair, I should note that it is not my assessment of the fiscal impact of that legislation. It is the combined assessment of the Congressional Budget Office and Joint Committee on Taxation. Collectively, we must rely on their status as nonpartisan arbiters in order for any budget process to function as intended. Mr. Chairman, just yesterday, we heard from the CBO that our debt as a share of the economy is set to double over the next 3 decades. Mr. Chairman and Madam Co-Chair, I have 3 children. I have 3 grandchildren, and I have 4 great-grandchildren. The fiscal policies we've been pursuing are not only fiscally bankrupt, they are morally indefensible. I hope that this committee will include in its recommendations a restoration of transparent, accountable, congressionally directed spending that restores Congress's constitutional role and a return to the proven enforcement of PAYGO. I also hope that in making recommendations, you also recognize that at the end of the day, regardless of what changes you make or propose, in order to be effective, Congress has to want to follow whatever process it creates for itself. We have biennial budgeting. We call it the fixes to our structure of saying that we're going to spend at a certain number. And then we say that doesn't work. That's unrealistic. It was a good message. It was good pretense. And then we change it. We make a 2-year rule to suspend, sequester, which is a complicated word which starts with S, which stands for stupid. It's up to the majority to see that through that set the tone, even when it's not convenient. The Speaker said he wanted to consider things one at a time. He thought the committees had the advantage. Yes, then bring those bills discreetly to the floor and let them be considered one by one. It's inconvenient, particularly when you don't want to vote on the labor health bill, you don't want to vote on the defense bills. You package them. You hide them. You dissemble. As you can tell, Mr. Chairman, I feel pretty passionately about this because I think neither side has come to grips with the real problem, and that is we don't follow fiscal discipline. We pretend, we talk, but then it becomes too difficult. Because life and budgeting is a series of trade-offs, and we don't like to make trade-offs. Because trade-offs sometimes cost you political capital. You can do all the debate you want about process. But if we don't have the will to do what is right fiscally, our people will not be well served. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Appreciate the comments of the Democrat whip in the House. Are there any members who have a question? I'll throw one at the distinguished gentleman from Maryland, and that is, in your discussion, you talked about three things. The third topic, that being the political will. One of the things this committee has discussed numerous times and is under consideration, the concept of carrots or sticks, whatever it is. What can we do to motivate, influence in a positive way the kind of outcomes that we're looking for versus holding Congress accountable with a series of consequences for failing to do its job? Where is the Democrat whip on the subject of positive reinforcement or some kind of consequence as a means of bringing us to the political will to make these changes?
You mean beyond attaboy, good job, that was the right thing to do,
Yeah.
I presume.
Beyond optics. It's got to be beyond
I
optics.
think the pay-go is where you get to the rubber meets the road. It's where if you want to cut taxes, if you think, we're spending too much and we ought to cut revenues, fine. Cut spending. Don't cut taxes and then never cut spending. We don't cut spending. It is that we have different views of what spending ought to be on. I noted to the majority leader, 0 rescissions in defense. 0. Raise your hand, and I'm not saying this rhetorically, I don't want to put you on the spot, if you think there's not 0 rescissions in $700 billion we give to the Defense Department. Of course not. So you spend, some parties spend it here, some parties spend it here, but we spend it. If you had pay-go, if you really had to make choices, there would be tough choices, and we ought to make those tough choices. And the only way you make them is bipartisanly. And we don't do things bipartisanly. And when I was, frankly, the majority leader, we passed all 12 appropriation bills seriatim, one at a time, prior to the end of August. Excuse me, the end of the July break, or it might have been the first week in August. So I'm not sure what you mean, the carrots and sticks, but what we ought to do is discipline ourselves and have the will to be honest with the American people, to tell them there's not a free lunch, to tell them if you want a tax cut of $1.8 trillion, then there's going to be a trade-off. Something's going to give. It's not going to be, we're going to grow the economy and wonderful things are going to happen. CBO is saying that's not happened. The economy is showing that's not happened. It's not going to happen. It didn't happen in 1981 when I came here. It didn't happen in 2001 and 2003. We were promised great things were going to happen. We had the deepest, worst economy that I've experienced and anybody in this room has experienced, starting in December of '07. So what I'm saying, Mr. Chairman, is process is terrific. Will and courage are what is needed. To be honest with the American people and with ourselves and say, there is no free lunch. We're not going to cut revenues and all of a sudden, magically, we'll have the resources necessary to defend our country, to grow our economy, to feed our people, to make sure that America is all that it can be. That's what I'm saying, Mr. Chairman.
Appreciate your comments. Any other questions? All
Thank
right.
you very much.
Thank you, sir. Delighted to introduce our next witness, the gentleman from Tennessee, Senator Bob Corker. Sir, it's great to have you in front of the Joint Select Committee this morning. Again, as I said earlier, written comments will be made part of the record, and we'll give you the adequate amount of time to make your case this morning before this committee, and we appreciate you being here.
Thank you. Thank you for holding these meetings, and I appreciate what you're doing. I'll be very brief. I know we all are a little bit behind schedule. First of all, I came to Washington 11 and a half years ago, and one of the focuses was on fiscal issues. And what I've learned is that Democrats and Republicans both like to spend money. They just like to spend it on different things. I became a member of the Budget Committee a few years ago. It's been the biggest waste of time one can possibly imagine. It has nothing to do with the leadership of the committee. It's that it's nothing but a political tool each side uses. There's no policy put behind the changes. And as I've said to Senator Perdue and others, Senator Whitehouse, we ought to actually do away with the Budget Committee because it performs no useful function as it relates to causing us to be fiscally sound. Secondly, we major in the minors. There's all this talk about appropriations, so we spend the entire year focusing on 30% of what we spend, which again is majoring in the minors. 70% of the money we spend is on mandatory spending. These are programs that people are counting on, especially during the latter years of their life. We do nothing whatsoever to ensure that they're going to be fiscally sound. Everything ought to be, in my opinion, on budget, everything, including Social Security, which would cause us to focus on the fact that in the not too distant future, it's going to be fiscally unsound. So, you know, again, there's a lot of talk and a lot of work that goes into appropriations and budgeting each year, but we major in the minors. The appropriations process is, you know, that we have authorizing committees that have almost nothing is authorized. And so seriously, we ought to consider combining the authorizing functions and the appropriating functions together. It ought to be one. I talk to people on the Foreign Ops side. I'm chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, and there may be a little bit of hyperbole here, but they tell me they spend about 5 hours putting together over $50 billion worth of spending, whereas the authorizing committee itself spends all year doing hearings. It's totally ridiculous. So, look, I think you've got a big task. I would say, first of all, put everything on budget, everything. Look at combining the operations of both authorizing and appropriating. Do away with the Budget Committee and let a few leaders decide what the caps are going to be over the next couple of years, and quit using the budget itself as a political tool. Beyond that, I really don't have many comments.
We appreciate the gentleman for his appearance here this morning. Any questions?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
If I may,
Senator Whitehouse, welcome.
Senator Corker joins me on the Budget Committee, so he knows whereof he speaks, and I wanted to thank him for his work on the Budget Committee. He's one of the reform-minded folks. Before we entirely get rid of the Budget Committee, at least in the Senate, I think we should give it one last chance. And as I've said in my earlier comments and in the proposal that I've shared with the committee, I think there's a chance to create a bipartisan path that would actually have to be bipartisan in order to be taken, that would take into account the mathematical elements of the budget, all of them, healthcare spending, tax spending, the whole bit, and see if the Budget Committee can work together to get a bipartisan agreement that picks a debt to GDP safe point out in the future, figures out how long it'll take to get there, creates that glide slope, creates alarm bells for that glide slope, and then on a bipartisan basis, you know, polices us towards a safe and sustainable landing. If we can do that, then I think we'll have done the task that the Budget Committee is originally established to do. Now it's simply a support system for a reconciliation measure that allows a simple majority for a pet political project of the majority party, period, end of story. For that, it's not worth keeping it. But I do think that there's a step between getting rid of the damn thing and its current parlous state where we can give it one last chance to see if it can produce a sensible bipartisan result. And I'd like to hear Senator Corker's response to that.
Yeah, I think you may be putting off the inevitable, but I want to say that you and Senator Perdue have done great work together. You have a very ideological, y'all are vastly different in your view of the world, and yet y'all have worked together to come up with some processes that I think could well work.
So different, David?
With Senator McCaskill a few years ago, I introduced the CAP Act, which capped spending at a percentage of GDP. And I think y'all are looking at something very similar as it relates to total indebtedness. So I would encourage this committee to look at the work the two of you are doing. But everything has to be on budget. I think we would have to agree. And the problem is, as you mentioned, we use reconciliation with 50 votes, but it takes 60 votes in the Senate to put policies in place. So there's never policy follow-up to the budget proposals. I mean, just to talk about my side of the aisle, when you do away with ACA, but you keep the revenues that ACA is generating, obviously, it's a hoax, and the other side of the aisle does the same thing. So I hope that hope you'll be very successful in this. This is the greatest threat to our nation. There's been a lot of talk about the tax issues, and obviously, and from my perspective, it could have been done a little bit better. Then we turned right around and passed a spending bill that raises deficits $2 trillion over the next 10 years, and we don't even talk about it. So both sides are guilty of huge deficits. Both sides like to spend money just on different things, but the processes we have will never, as they're now constructed, do the things we want to do as a country. So thank you all very much, and thank you for your work.
Thank you, Senator Corker, for your testimony this morning. Next witness, I'd like to welcome the ranking member on the Defense Subcommittee of the House Appropriations Committee, distinguished gentleman from Indiana, Pete Visclosky. Welcome, sir. The floor is yours.
Chairman, thank you very much, and I understand my entire statement is entered into the record.
That is correct.
I would begin by taking a dangerous path and answering the question I have not been asked. You asked the minority whip about possible incentives, carrots, and sticks to have members of Congress abide by some form of discipline. I would suggest to you our incentive is our responsibility to the next generation and have the discipline to make the hard decisions that my parents' generation made for me. The second point I would make is I came here 41 years ago and began my career as a staffer on the Appropriations Committee. At this moment in time, I absolutely agree with Senator Corker. If you would make one change tomorrow, I would get rid of the Budget Act of the 1970s. The fact is, you have so few people, and think about your experience, on that committee who are charged with making the hard decision of raising revenue, the hard decision of the expenditure of those revenues in an effective and efficient manner, that people make assumptions. I'm the ranking Democrat on defense appropriations. DOD does not run on assumptions. It runs on hard decisions. There is nothing in any rule today in either body that prohibits us from getting our work done. And no rule or law we could create is going to imbue members of Congress with the political will to act. I do not believe our budget and appropriations process is broken. Instead, it shows what happens when we avoid making decisions in a disciplined fashion. Some would point to the use of a 2-year deal, like multiple bipartisan budget acts of the past half-decade. However, I would argue that moving to a biannual budget does not fix the root cause of our unpredictable funding timelines, but simply creates severe risks to good governance. As it has become Congress's habit to only pass bipartisan legislation on the eve of a governmental crisis, our problems do not lessen if we just drag out that process for 2 years instead of 1. Agencies already tell us how hard it is to execute funds when they receive appropriations 5 months late. Let's give them 2 years to drag this process out, and it would simply give agencies more time to fill our requests with out-of-cycle demands. Let us take the fiscal year 2018 Defense Appropriations Bill as an example. The House of Representatives voted for that bill 5 times before it became law last March. It was comparatively painless for members of Congress. However, it wreaked havoc in the Department of Defense. Just one example. The National Guard exercises had to be canceled, which affected over 102,000 service personnel. There's nothing in the current rules that make this happen except an absence of intestinal fortitude. By potentially reducing the required interactions between Congress and the executive agencies by extending the process to 2 years, we also sacrifice, I believe, the most up-to-date and accurate information about how American taxpayers' dollars are spent, relinquishing our specified constitutional responsibility. An example from this year. This year has brought several executive branch trade enforcement changes, including tariffs on steel and aluminum. These actions have resulted in unexpected workloads for agencies. Both the House and Senate Appropriations Committee have been in constant contact with those agencies regarding the resources that are now needed to effectively manage these immediate changes. Regardless of what any of your position is on the tariffs, I think we can all agree that effective management of policy changes is key to the daily functioning of our government. Let's change the rules, and that's going to solve our problem. We did that in 2010 with the Budget Control Act, and we had sticks. Nobody in their right mind would allow us to shut down the government or have sequestration. And the fact is, on 4 different occasions since 2010, Congress has set aside that act for 7 out of the last 8 years because it does not work. We have our defense appropriations bill on the House floor last night and today again. If we do not address that rule change of 2010 between now and October, we have $71 billion that are going to be taken off that budget for the department next year, so they're writing 2 different budgets. The rule change certainly solved our problems. I would simply say that the intervening 8 years have proven that absent a commitment to governing in a sober, deliberative, and well-intentioned fashion, this problem is not going to be solved. I believe we can solve the so-called budget problem if we approach the appropriations process in a serious manner. If we finally come together to meaningfully address entitlements that now consume 2/3 of our budget and prevent investment in the future. And finally recognize, as my home state of Indiana has done, that a reasonable amount of new revenue is necessary if we are truly going to invest in the future of our children. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Appreciate the gentleman from Indiana for his testimony here this morning. Pleased to welcome our next witness. We had scheduled in tandem both Rob Bishop of Utah and Devin Nunez of California. I know Mr. Bishop has got other commitments this morning, so we're pleased to welcome Representative Nunez from California, sir. Thank you for being here this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We'll give you the floor for 5 minutes, sir.
It's great to be here, and I will be brief, but I will make my points. But I want to also add that Mr. Bishop had a committee hearing that he had to begin at 10 o'clock, and he had to be there. That's why he had to leave. But he is strongly in favor of this proposal that I'm about to outline for the committee here. This is something that I offered before the Republican conference began in this beginning of this Congress, and it actually received 40% of the vote within our conference. I think it failed largely because people get used to sitting on a budget committee, sitting on the Appropriations Committee, and they didn't want to make change. And look, this is a big change that I'm proposing here because it would essentially abolish all the committees and combine the authorizing committees and the appropriations committees. So on the House side, which is what we would control, it would create 14 appropriating and authorizing committees. There would be 5 select committees. Every member on the House side would be able to choose 2 of those committees. And the Budget Committee would actually, you might like this, Mr. Chairman, being chairman of the Budget Committee would become, I think, fairly powerful. It wouldn't meet very often, but it would be made up of the committee chairman and the ranking members so that there was actually real authority pushing that power down to the authorizing and appropriating committees. One of the concerns that was raised at the time by some of the members when we lost that vote 60-40 in our conference was that a lot of our members, even though knowing they sit on 3 authorizing committees with absolutely no power, some didn't vote for it because they said, well, I'm in line to be chairman of whatever authorizing committee, even though I know you're doing the right thing. So one of the things that we want to make sure of in this proposal is that whether you're on the Appropriations Committee or the authorizing committee, you would keep your seniority and you would fall in line with whatever committees you fall under. So there'd have to be a fair process put in place for that. All this closed by another example. Just last night, I chair the Intelligence Committee, and last night in the Defense Appropriations Committee, there is several provisions that allow authorizing on the Defense Appropriations bill that'll be on the floor this week. And once again, that will happen, despite the objections from myself and the members of my committee. So this is never going to get fixed until we decide to pull it out by the roots and start anew. And I think that all members, at least on the House side, I can't speak for the Senate side because I've never served in the Senate, but on the House side, I think it would really allow members to actually participate, hold the executive branch accountable, have real power. Because you guys may not admit this publicly, but I will tell you that nobody in the executive branch takes any of us seriously unless you are an appropriator and a senior appropriator. If not, all they do is feed you a line, they know they're going to wait you out, and nothing ever gets done. So sorry for those of you who only serve on authorizing committees, but nobody really cares if you're here or not. And with that, I'll yield back.
Thank the gentleman from California for his testimony this morning. Thank you, Devin.
Thank you.
Our next witness, gentleman from Pennsylvania, Representative Keith Rothfuss. Good to have you here, sir. Committee looks forward to your testimony, and the floor is yours. Turn that mic on, Keith, right in front of you.
Chairman, thank you. Co-chairman, Chairwoman, thank you for the opportunity to testify before this committee, and thank the members of this committee for this very challenging work that you have ahead of you. Here in Washington, we hear so much about how our system is broken and Congress doesn't work, but I don't think we understand how profoundly broken it is. In the over 4 decades under our current budgeting process, Congress has only passed all 12 appropriation bills on time 4 times. Think about that. Failing to follow regular order isn't the exception, it's the norm. Due to this chronic failure, we in Congress are forced to vote on massive omnibus packages and continuing resolutions, often with very little time to read them. We are constantly presented a false choice between voting on these cumbersome bills or letting the government shut down. In effect, members are given 1 vote instead of 12 votes or even hundreds of votes on the opportunity to offer amendments. When we are voting on legislation hundreds of pages long with very little notice, we cannot accurately represent what we see in our districts. This haphazard budgeting process also makes it virtually impossible to actually prioritize spending in any meaningful way while our national debt continues to explode. Further, it seems every time we pass one of these monstrosities, we hear about more provisions that seemingly nobody knew were included. This is absurd and needs to change. Issues should be debated on their merits, one at a time. We should have ample time to dissect and read all bills considered, and we should allow for feedback from our districts before taking the vote. It's for these reasons in previous years that I introduced the Pay for Performance Act. This legislation would have withheld pay for either chamber if they failed to complete all 12 appropriation bills on time. There may be a better way to incentivize these bodies to get the work done, perhaps no August recess until appropriation bills are done. We need an incentive like this to get our process back in order. Or maybe we need a new process entirely. Either way, a 90% failure rate is unacceptable by any metric, and we should demand better. Government's going to be funded. We know that. If it's not going to be funded on September 30th, it's going to be funded by October 20th, or November 18th, or December 22nd, or February 18th. This is an act of the will. We know deadlines are coming. Every taxpayer in this country knows that April 15th, they have to file something. Even if they have to file an extension, they have to pay taxes due. We know government is going to be funded. There is no reason why we can't get this done by September 30th. I sincerely thank everybody for this work that you're undertaking. I encourage you to look at this from different angles. I was just listening to Chairman Nunez and his suggestions. You know, we have 12 appropriations bills that lump different agencies together. Is that the best practice? You need to take a look at that. Should there be more types of bills? We can vote on these things. You take a bill, the one we considered last week, where we did, or a couple weeks ago when we did the minibus, or even you look at something like the labor HHS, what combines 3 agencies. Should these be divided further? We also need a process where we can be having discussions about some binary choices and prioritizing. That's what families around this country do around the dinner table. You know, if you have an emergency at home, you might have to put off resealing the driveway so that you know that the lights are going to stay on or the plumbing stays on. We need a mechanism of some sort where if we want to increase funding in one area, we should be able to ask that that could come from another area, and it shouldn't necessarily happen in the same appropriations bill. There may be something I want to propose for an increase in labor H, but I'd want to pay for it out of another bill. There's no mechanism to do that. So again, I applaud this committee for the work that you're undertaking. I encourage you, and I look forward to further interaction with this committee, and I look forward to your reports. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Representative Rothfuss, for your testimony this morning. We're going to stay in Pennsylvania. Our next witness is Representative Lloyd Smucker from Pennsylvania 10. Representative Smucker, we appreciate the opportunity to hear from you this morning. The floor is yours. Microphone, please.
Thank you, Chairman Womack and Chairwoman Lowy. Members of the Joint Select Committee on Budget and Appropriations Reform, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. First, I'd like to begin by extending my sincere appreciation for the work of this Select Committee. You all have been tasked with accomplishing an incredibly important job, fixing the broken federal budget process. As a freshman member of the House Budget Committee, I received quite an education over the last 18 months about how we conduct business here in Congress. We lurch from one CR to the next, an average of 4 per year. Since our budget process was last overhauled in 1974, the government has been shut down more than 20 times. In fact, the 12 required appropriations bills have passed on time just once in 43 years. Particularly when contrasted with my experience as a business owner and then as a state legislator in Pennsylvania, I think it's fair to say that the wheels have completely come off our annual budgeting process. But you already know that, and you know the results. A crushing debt that threatens our security and our economic vitality, a system that is failing the American people, and a rather bleak outlook for our kids and grandkids if we can't change the trajectory. We come here to solve big problems, and it's not too late to place this country on a fiscal path, on a sound fiscal path. We can do it, and we must. I've come to believe that it must start with reforming the process. We must reform the budget process and reform the way Congress works to achieve the results that we need. And I also happen to believe that this commission is our best opportunity in a long time to do so. My purpose today is to share the experience of a commission in the Pennsylvania legislature that worked, that took on a similar systemic, long-term problem and found solutions. In fact, it had worked so well that I thought it was a good model to tackle budget reform, and before the establishment of this Select Committee, had introduced legislation that would have established a similar joint commission. My hope is that sharing how it worked in Pennsylvania will spark a few thoughts or ideas that could be useful to you in your work and your ultimate success. So just a little background. The committee in Pennsylvania was the Basic Education Funding Commission and was tasked with determining a new formula to distribute education dollars to 500 districts all across the state. Everyone agreed, similar to what we have here, that the current system was completely broken, but multiple attempts to fix it over a period of 30 years had produced absolutely no results. The commission was formed, worked for about 16 months, then provided a unanimous recommendation, which was taken up by the legislature, then passed and signed into law by the governor. As chair of the State Education Committee at that time, I was a member of the commission and sponsor of the final bill. Several things about the commission were important and may be helpful. The makeup of the committee was important. It was bipartisan and bicameral. It was an inside committee like this, 3 members from each party in each house, including the chairs of the relevant committees. It also included 3 members of the executive branch, including the budget secretary and the education secretary. All of the key decision makers were in the room and were included in the process. The process itself was equally important. All deliberations were open and were transparent. And in our case, we held multiple hearings across the state, inviting anyone who wanted to participate to testify and provide input, including experts from other states, educators, and even members of the general public. That not only provided the best thinking available, but also created a loud echo chamber across the state and buy-in from all stakeholders. Remarkably, the work of the commission in Pennsylvania spanned 2 administrations, Republican and Democrat. Members from the executive branch changed midway through the process. Even so, the recommendation was unanimous and was fully endorsed by the new governor. Sticking to the original purpose of the commission was also critical. It was tasked with finding a formula, but during hearings received a lot of pressure to increase the scope of its work. We worked really hard to keep the goal narrowly focused on the specific problem that we wanted to fix. While your commission may not be designed in exactly the same way as ours in Pennsylvania, I know it can work and that you can make a difference. I applaud you for your work and believe this is the best opportunity we have to fix the broken federal budget process and deliver real, systemic, and meaningful budget reforms. I look forward to the work that you're doing and to supporting you in the best way that we can in the legislature. We share a common goal of wanting to fix the troubled state of our nation's fiscal health, and that starts with reforming the broken federal budget process. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Smucker, for your testimony this morning. Our next witness is a gentleman from Ohio, Representative Warren Davidson. Representative Davidson, the committee appreciates the opportunity to hear from you this morning. And with that, the floor is yours. Please engage your microphone, and you've got 5 minutes for testimony.
Thank you, Chairman, and thanks to the full committee. I really appreciate your attention to this, and you know, we're all in the same boat, but you guys are doing the work. Really could spend the whole time talking about how important it is to move past the broken Budget Control Act of 1974 and to do just really basic things like have a meaningful Gantt chart that shows what can happen in parallel and what can happen sequentially so that we get our work done on time, as the country should expect us to do. I couldn't emphasize how important it is that we put everything on appropriations, not just some things. And the autopilot is got us headed for a crash. But one of the more meaningful things that I think we could do in reform is to understand how our accounting department works. Essentially, the Congressional Budget Office serves as our accounting department. Each of us doesn't have one of these functions in our office. And unfortunately, most of the time, we don't even, as individual members, have access to real reports from accounting. They might give us the final summary, but they won't show us the details. And so I think the Congressional Budget Office should fully embrace our Show Your Work Act, and I ask that you would. I've received some feedback about some concerns and would love to try to address a few of those. For background, the Joint Select Committee on Budget and Appropriations was established by this act, so we've got a process to review things. The CBO has an incredibly important role in providing budget and cost analysis for legislation in Congress. Given the weight of these scores, members of Congress have to use for policy decisions. It should be a top priority that CBO standards are of the highest possible quality so that they may provide the best possible analysis for policymakers. When CBO fails to accurately predict the impact of policies, legislators lack the resources to make educated decisions. Examples include healthcare. Upon passage of the Affordable Care Act, CBO projected 21 million people would be enrolled in the exchanges in 2016. In reality, roughly 10 million people signed up, making for an overshot of 120%. The healthcare debate in 2014, CBO predicted Medicaid expansion would cost $42 billion in 2015. The reality was $68 billion, about 62% higher. And most recently on tax reform, projected that the economy would only grow by 0.4% extra. Because of tax reform, we see the results are meaningfully different than that. So what the legislation does is it requires CBO to publish online all data, models, and processes utilized in their analysis and scoring. It specifies that data and information provided must be sufficient so that individuals outside of CBO can understand, replicate, and reproduce the results found within. Essentially, this is the same thing that academics expect, and it would come with some of the same safeguards. CBO should not be allowed to disclose certain data sets. Instead, they would publish a complete list of data variables for that data, including descriptive statistics, averages, standard deviations, and correlations, a reference to the statute or rule preventing them from disclosing, for example, personally identifiable information, and the contact information for the individual or entity that has unrestricted access to the data. So, for example, we wouldn't need to know the contents of everyone's tax return or, frankly, the detailed pricing of any one pharmaceutical. We would need to know aggregate data to be able to simulate the model. We might not need to know how an individual company priced their drugs to model prescription drugs, for example. The bill is very important because it would allow the same sorts of review that go on in normal companies. Accounting departments have healthy debates. They have accountability that comes from the board questioning the accounting department. If you ask a leader of a business unit how to steer the business unit, it's unfathomable that the leader of that business unit wouldn't be able to go to the accounting department and get a detailed answer as to why that was the cost model if you tried to apply this to the corporate world. I believe we're owed it as members of Congress, individual members, and I certainly believe that the American people are owed it, and I hope that you can find a way to address the concerns that have been expressed that are valid about how to protect personally identifiable information or proprietary information, but the American people need to know how our accounting department derives their recommendations so that it can be truly respected as a nonpartisan entity that it is. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Davidson, for your testimony this morning. Our next witness is Representative French Hill, my distinguished colleague from Arkansas, member of the Financial Services Committee. Gentleman from Arkansas is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. I congratulate the chairman on a great victory by Arkansas last night in his district. I know he stayed up late watching that game.
Pig suey.
My best wishes to the ranking member, members of the committee. Experiencing frustration and dissatisfaction with the actual functioning of the Congressional Budget Act of 1974 is not new or remotely original. This committee's shelves are stacked with binders of worthy and not so worthy suggestions from 4 decades of bipartisan complaining. My first exposure to concrete recommendations for wholesale change came from my former boss on Capitol Hill, Senator John Tower of Texas, an original member of the Senate Budget Committee and chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Senator Tower offered his restructuring proposals in his 1991 memoir, Consequences. He argued strongly for a 2-year budget cycle to get off the budgetary treadmill, and he argued that there be less executive branch testimony before authorizing, appropriating, and budget committees by streamlining that witness approach. In the last 2 decades, Congress's budgetary muscles have atrophied, rarely completing a budget or passing appropriations measures prior to fiscal year ends. It's really sad how little that's happened since 1974. Gosh, not since 1996, and that's back when Vice President Gore was still inventing the internet. The results, the administrative state has grown unwieldy and more immune to oversight. In Article 1, the Congress's appropriation oversight responsibilities are their most fundamental. The debt has grown unabated with the burden of net interest that is expected to soon reach more than the entire appropriation for defense, and by 2027 reach approximately $1 trillion, the approximate size of today's entire discretionary budget. The government is run from one dysfunctional CR to another, periodically punctuated by an unaccountable omnibus appropriation that pleases no one. All the while, mandatory spending programs grow at 3 or 4 times the rate of macroeconomic growth, with little public discussion or oversight and rarely, if any, votes being held for restructuring in the Congress. So, what to do? Let me first endorse fully, Mr. Chairman, the 2-year budget cycle for annual budget resolutions and having a 2-year spending allocation under that resolution. Watching the House move all 12 appropriations bills last summer in a 120-day period made us all realize that our muscles can be strengthened, and we can do that, and I commend Senator Shelby's work as well this year. So I think the 2-year cycle is good. Unauthorized programs. You know, in business, where I spent 3 decades, this kind of thing just wouldn't even be considered in the real world. Establishing a budget procedure whereby spending is reduced by the amount of excess appropriations for unauthorized programs would be a worthy change. Thus, the committees, authorizing committees would not fund, appropriations committees would not fund unauthorized or expired programs. Likewise, all authorizing committees would file their views and estimates, including a list of every program about to expire or that required reauthorization, and use a zero-based budget justification for every program so identified. I have a list of things that I entitle, Mr. Chairman, Stop Kidding Ourselves. Number 1, prohibit budget gimmicks. Stop committees from using one-time shifts in timing or asset sales to offset ongoing spending increases. Permit any member to offer an amendment to strike emergency spending designation in any measure. Insist that the Congressional Budget Office and the Office of Management and Budget baseline budget eliminate their built-in discretionary inflation, automatic extensions of expired programs, and that mandatory spending programs continue at current levels even when trust funds are insolvent. On better transparency, I think every fact sheet by the Budget Committee and the Appropriations Committee for all members and senators should propose plainly what the outlay is for the proposed fiscal year compared to the past 5 years of actual outlays, noting the percentage increase and decrease. All federal insurance and retirement programs, excluding Social Security, ought to be put on accrual budgeting, requiring the Congress to fully budget all the costs in those programs. And finally, Mr. Chairman, I really think that Tom McClintock's Default Prevention Act, which requires the Department of Treasury to continue to borrow to pay the principal and interest on certain obligations if the debt exceeds its statutory limit, is a worthy change that this bicameral committee ought to recommend. I think it will take off the table the periodic debt ceiling limit that causes our debate to not be as positive as it could be. And finally, a regulatory budget. I hope that you will consider a regulatory budget in addition to a budget resolution, and I thank you for the time to testify.
Thank the gentleman from Arkansas for his testimony. We're going to hear from one more witness, and we're going to take our promised break, albeit about 15 minutes late. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jim Renacci. Representative Renacci, we're pleased to have you this morning. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the co-chairs of the Joint Select Committee for holding this hearing and allowing members of Congress to share their ideas and proposals. Look, I got here 7.5 years ago as a business guy who balances budgets, who makes things work, and who continues to believe we need budgets. The problem is our budgetary system is broken. I spent a lot of time since being elected here of looking at financial processes, everything from how we can develop a financial statement to how we can develop a process where we can start with a budget. But let's first say, you can't even prepare a budget if you don't know where you're at. And one of the biggest problems I said in Washington is most members of Congress don't really know financially where we are because we don't have a fiscal accounting, we don't have a fiscal financial statement, and we don't have a fiscal address. So what I am proposing is two bills that actually I think fix the budget process. Number one, you first have to have awareness. I believe it's critical the American people in Congress are aware of the financial system that our country faces. So I have introduced a bill that would just do that. It's pretty simple. All it does is require the Comptroller General of the General Accounting Office to provide a fiscal State of the Nation address to a joint session of Congress on an annual basis. The presentation would include an analysis of the condition of our country's fiscal status including our budget deficits, long-term fiscal projections for our social insurance programs. It will be a presentation of our fiscal issues, and it will be public for all Americans. Right now, our country is in the cups of national debt crisis. By 2023, the CBO projects that we will spend more paying down our interest than we will on our national defense. By 2028, the debt held by public as a share of GDP will increase to 96%, the largest since 1946. Most members of Congress don't know that. By the way, I've also said that every member of Congress should be on the Budget Committee at least one cycle. Most members of Congress are not aware of that. And as lawmakers, we have a moral responsibility to address these changes and work together to find bipartisan solutions to starve off this pending crisis. A strong first step would be requiring Congress to come together once a year to hear from a nonpartisan Comptroller General what the fiscal state of the country is in order to highlight the crisis that we face and put members on notice to the public that this is an issue that needs to be addressed. The best way to tackle a problem is to first shine light on the problem. At my request, the Comptroller General has testified before the House Budget Committee in recent years, and I believe that this issue is too important that the full Congress not be made aware of it. Some will say a joint session of Congress is not the right venue for this type of speech. I would highly disagree. I would counter by asking doubters why they believe this isn't as important enough issue to convene a joint session and why they are afraid to set the new precedent. I have almost 200 co-sponsors on this bill. The first time I dropped it last cycle. This cycle, I'm getting close to 200 bipartisan Democrats and Republicans who agree to this. We shouldn't be afraid of doing it. Additionally, the legislation was included in the 2016 Budget Committee Budget Reform White Paper, has been endorsed by the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, the AICPA, the Concord Coalition, and the National Taxpayer Union. It's something we should not be afraid of. It's something we should be looking forward to seeing every year so we know where we have to start before we do the budget process. Along with that awareness, I think we need to do a better job at holding ourselves accountable. The second bill I've introduced would make Congress actually abide by the budget that we pass. Since 1974, we waive our budgets. Every time we turn around, it gets waived in budget in the committee anyway, it gets waived, and that's a problem. We can't waive the committee. Too often, the Rules Committee waives budget-related issues, preventing members of Congress to object to legislation that breaks the budget. If you want to break the budget, that's all well and good. In the business world, you break it all the time, but what you do is you come before management, which is the Congress, and you tell people why. This bill would allow members of the House to call for a recorded vote on these waivers and put members on the record whether they wish to waive the budget. As someone who has spent my career in the business world, I believe it's important that we pass a budget and follow the budget. This bipartisan legislation will allow Congress responsibility to ourselves and ensure that we actually follow our budget. I commend the work that the Joint Committee is doing in reforming our broken budget process. I believe that these two measures that I discussed today should be considered as part of the broader reforms that are needed to fix the budget process. I want to thank you again for your time, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Ohio for his testimony this morning. Our next witness is here, but we have promised our committee that we're going to take just a few-minute break for a comfort break, check email, make whatever phone calls you need to make. So at this time, if it pleases the co-chair, I think we'll take a break and resume our testimony at 5 till the hour. That would be in about 11 minutes. So the chair declares this Joint Select Committee on Budget and Process Reform for Members' Day to be in recess for about 10 minutes. The Joint Select Committee on Budget Process Reform Members' Day will resume. The co-chair and I do appreciate the cooperation and the participation of our members of the committee and those members that are making presentations here today. We're running just a few minutes late. We do appreciate the patience of our next witness, Ms. Jayapal, and we will proceed now with her testimony and then go straight toward the end in hopes of getting us back a little bit more on time, although running about 15 minutes late is about on time for Congress, in my opinion, based on my experience. But nonetheless, our next witness is Pramila Jayapal from Washington, and the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her positions on this subject, and the floor is yours, Ms. Jayapal.
Thank you so much, Chairman Womack, and thank you to Chairwoman Lowy as well for holding this hearing and for all your dedicated work. Since I've come to Congress, I've heard a lot of talk about the budget process being broken. And as the vice-ranking member of the House Budget Committee under the great leadership of Mr. Yarmouth, I've been able to look at the process up close and consider how we use it. What's obvious is that there is a process on the books that has the promise of being able to be used effectively, but in reality it has been thwarted time and time again. As a Budget Committee member, I plan to focus my remarks today on the Budget Committee's role. And first, I'd like to give a little bit of context. The budget resolution process was designed to give Congress a voice in setting fiscal policy. And prior to the enactment of the Congressional Budget Act of 1974, which established the budget committees as well as the Congressional Budget Office, Congress did not have its own source of budgetary information and didn't have a procedure to establish an overall fiscal framework. Rather, the executive branch housed budgetary information and was the only source of a fiscal plan. Congress acted on that plan in a piecemeal fashion, with each committee reviewing proposals in its jurisdiction. There was no approval of overall levels of revenue, spending, and the resulting deficits and debt. Clearly, that was not a good way to budget. Revenue and spending decisions should not be made in separate silos. Each has an impact on deficits and debt. Changes in one are going to fundamentally require changes in the other, a change in the overall fiscal path, or both. And a perfect example is the recent tax bill. The Republican majority made a decision to cut revenues substantially, even though long-term deficits were already unsustainably high. That was then used to justify calls for even deeper spending cuts. And Americans across the country, it had severe consequences for Americans across the country who are struggling to make ends meet, to pay for health care, or even to put food on the table. The good news is that the budget resolution can and has been used to lay out a framework of priorities. Used properly, the budget resolution provides a way to lay out Congress's priorities, both for overall fiscal policy and for distribution across major functions or areas of national need. The reconciliation process provides a path to enact spending cuts or revenue increases included in a budget resolution that might require difficult votes. Major deficit reduction packages that implemented policies assumed in the budget resolution have been enacted, including those during the Clinton administration that led to budget surpluses. The budget resolution should and has set the stage for the Appropriations Committee to do their work. But sadly, the budget resolution has become only a messaging document rather than a governing document. It has incorporated policies that the majority doesn't actually plan to move during the upcoming year. And for example, in recent years, trillions of dollars of savings are called for in the resolution, but are not included in the reconciliation directives. That is the mechanism to enforce the cuts. It's called reconciliation because the whole point of the process is to reconcile federal law with the amounts assumed in the budget resolution. Failing to reconcile trillions of dollars in cuts suggests that the cuts are not meant to be real. Likewise, discretionary spending has been put at artificially low levels, even though there's widespread agreement that higher levels will be needed. Much of the savings in both categories has been unspecified, meaning that it's impossible to tell from the budget resolution what Congress's true priorities are. Revenue cuts have been sold as likely to cost nothing, even as the Joint Tax Committee's best estimates show that is not the case. None of this engenders respect or credibility for the process or for those of us who serve in Congress. It's time for all of us to step up and recognize that we can do better. The budget resolution process has a means to define what we want fiscal policy to be and a set of enforcement procedures to help us get there. There may need to be improvements to the process that can help make things move more smoothly, and we should welcome them. But realistically, we can't expect them to fix this. Rather, we need to approach the process with a realistic understanding of what we can do, a willingness to compromise when necessary, and a readiness to accept analysis on what policies will cost and save produced by our own in-house, nonpartisan experts. If we don't do that, we have ourselves to blame for not being able to muster the resolve to use the process that we have efficiently. I thank you very much for your work and for your focus on this issue.
Thank the gentlelady from Washington for her testimony this morning. Our next witness is Representative David Price from the great state of North Carolina. Representative Price, we appreciate you appearing before the committee this morning, and the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Co-Chair Womack and Co-Chair Lowy and other members of the Select Committee. I appreciate the chance to testify today, and I'll submit the full copy of my text for the record. I've been following the work of this committee, and like much of what I've heard, the possibility of ending debt ceiling brinksmanship, for example, or of moving to a calendar year budget cycle. But one of the ideas you're considering has set off alarm bells. And for that reason, I'd like to take a few minutes to detail my objections to a bad idea, namely moving to a biennial appropriations process. I first testified about biennial budgeting about 20 years ago before the House Rules Committee, which was considering legislation to transition Congress to biennial appropriations. Then, our fiscal situation was quite different. The enactment of comprehensive multi-year budget agreements in 1990, 1993, and 1997 coupled with a growing economy, had produced several years of balanced budgets. In fact, we'd been able to pay off $400 billion of the national debt. Since then, we've had 2 unpaid-for wars, a necessary but expensive countercyclical response to the Great Recession, massive unpaid-for tax cuts, and now 7 years of extremely partisan and largely dysfunctional congressional budget politics. So it's understandable that the idea of biennial appropriations would once again hold some appeal as a panacea for members in search of solutions to our current woes. But this is truly a case in which the remedy would be worse than the disease. Of course, I understand the congressional budget and appropriations process have eroded significantly. The pressures of divided government and a polarized electorate, the increased use of the Senate filibuster, the general subjugation of Congress's constitutional power of the purse to partisan political considerations, all of these factors have greatly delayed the enactment of our annual spending bills and increased our reliance on continuing resolutions and omnibus packages. But biennial budgeting, by which I mean biennial appropriations, would do nothing to address the underlying causes of this dysfunction. It actually might make matters worse by weakening congressional oversight of the executive, jacking even more decisions up to the leadership of both parties, and increasing our reliance on supplemental appropriations bills considered outside the regular order. I want to stress that these same arguments do not apply to a multi-year budget agreement of the sort that served us so well in the 1990s. Nor do they apply to a 2-year budget resolution of the sort Congress passed a few months ago. Indeed, our current appropriations work has greatly facilitated by the fact that that is a 2-year plan. But appropriations is another matter. The thorough review of individual agency programs and the determination of new funding levels must have year-to-year flexibility and is distinct from determining budgetary top-line numbers. My arguments this morning are directed to the 12 appropriations bills that must be passed under any budget agreement, no matter the duration of that agreement. Now, proponents of biennial appropriations claim that it would free up Congress to conduct oversight in the off year. That's a supremely ironic claim, for the most careful and effective oversight Congress does is through the annual appropriations process, when an agency's performance and needs are reviewed program by program, line by line. Off-year oversight would be less, not more effective, because it would be further removed from actual funding decisions, reducing Congress's leverage. As the ranking member of the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Transportation and Housing, I've seen firsthand the value of annual appropriations bills and how it bolsters congressional oversight. For example, last year, the Federal Transit Administration made several administrative and policy changes, procedural changes to the Capital Investments Transit Program, the New Starts program. State and local agencies face considerable uncertainty about how their projects would be reviewed and whether they could count on federal funding commitments. Members of both sides of the aisle reached out to the Appropriations Committee with their concerns. So in response, our committee included several provisions and report language in the fiscal 18 Omnibus Appropriations Bill on a bipartisan, bicameral basis, directing FTA to provide grantees with updated project ratings and to administer the program in accordance with the law. What if we'd had to wait an additional year to do that? To wait an extra year to enact these policy provisions might have resulted in the failure of several large transit projects across the country. And the ability of the committee to quickly respond to executive branch action proved decisive. Annual appropriations bills also serve as a way to respond to court rulings that may invalidate or make workable existing policies. They facilitate other policy tweaks that would otherwise fail to garner floor time. These housekeeping items, as we call them, almost always are dealt with on a bipartisan basis, and they are vital to ensuring the effective function of government. A biennial appropriations process would also pose special challenges during the second year of the two-year budget cycle. Just think about this. Under the existing appropriations cycle, federal agencies typically begin formulating their budgets in the summer of the year before the President submits his budget request to Congress in February. That's a full 14 to 15 months in advance of the start of the actual fiscal year. Now, if you ask agencies to put a budget request for the second year of a two-year cycle forward as much as 28 months in advance, that would require a level of planning and foresight that just might not be possible or realistic given the uncertainty of revenue and expenditure projections, the continually evolving challenges of the federal government. For example, the tenant-based rental assistance program, often referred to as Section 8 vouchers. At the beginning of a cost cycle, we receive estimates from HUD regarding renewals.
Gentleman's running out of time. In fact,
all right, if I could,
your time has expired.
All right, I'll leave the Section 8 example for the record and wrap up, Mr. Chairman. What I'm saying, though, it pertains to the second year of an appropriations cycle, and I just think we would have more supplemental appropriations bills, more reprogramming, and all the rest. So, in conclusion, the whole purpose of the biennial budget could be undermined by the proliferation of supplementals in the off year. Personally, we would have replaced the deliberative and democratic process of appropriations with supplemental bills that are sporadic, rushed, and heavily controlled by leadership. So I don't think biennial appropriations is any better an idea today than it was 15 or 20 years ago. It would be a mistake to let recent budget agreements lure us toward a supposed remedy that would actually make appropriations less systematic, less flexible, and less potent. We all know that the process has broken down.
Thank you,
but biennial
gentlemen,
budget
for your
none of this.
here,
I urge
this
that
morning.
we reject this siren
I'm
call
going
and
to allow
address the
the
underlying
co-chair
causes of our
to
budget
make
programs.
a
Thank
quick
you, Mr.
statement.
Chairman.
Ms. Lowy.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to comment quickly on your presentation, perhaps because I agree with you 100%, and I think you present very carefully crafted arguments, and I know that your testimony will be an important part of the final record that we will review as we are making decisions. So I just wanted to thank you again for the careful preparation of your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank the gentlelady, and as is the case with all members, written statements will be made a part of the official record of this event today. Thank you, Representative Price. Our next witness is the gentleman from Montana, the senator from Montana, Steve Daines. Mr. Daines will have 5 minutes for his presentation. And the Joint Select Committee appreciates the time that you've taken to appear before the Member Day program here this morning, and we give you the floor, sir.
Co-chairs Womack and Lowy, thank you for your leadership and for convening this Members' Day. It gives us an opportunity to share our experience and how to improve the very broken budget and appropriations process. I serve on the Appropriations Committee in the United States Senate, so my remarks are somewhat framed by my experience of about 3 years in the Senate. I also want to thank Senator Perdue for his commitment to reform the budget process. David and I have been working a lot before the Select Committee was put together. I'm grateful for it. Thank you for elevating it to this level. Many of the members currently serving in Congress come from business backgrounds, and I think we can take some of that experience. It's not the only experience that's going to help in this area, of course, but it will help us, I think, and frame a better process going forward. This process is incredibly broken, so it should be no surprise that a profoundly broken process delivers a very bad result. Having spent 28 years in the private sector, passing a budget is not optional. You must pass a budget. In fact, passing a balanced budget is not optional. You must do that as well, or else you're out of business. $21.1 trillion of debt, $33.8 trillion of debt in 10 years. We have no option but to change the budget and the appropriations process. I just want to jump right into policy. I'm going to try to remove the bun and get to the meat here. Let me share 4 recommendations that I have for this prestigious Select Committee. First of all, I would combine the authorizing committees with the corresponding Appropriations Committee, consolidate them, and then completely dissolve the Budget Committee. By doing this, we can start having real conversations about where to spend and how to spend it. Currently, we have 2 processes on different tracks that simply don't sync up. Integrating the processes into one committee will ensure more coordination and better outcomes. The biggest single challenge of doing that will be leadership itself in these committees. Members stay here for a long time. They get to committee chairs. That, I think, will be the single greatest barrier that we'll face in trying to implement that reform. But it would, I think Senator Perdue and others have shown this incredible spaghetti tangle of authorizing committees and appropriation committees, and then we have this Budget Committee on top of that. And it's no wonder this process produces a bad result. It's very complicated and it's not unified. I think we could significantly improve this process by dissolving the Budget Committee, bring authorizing and approps into single committees that line up with their respective jurisdictions. Number 2, the budget should be a law, not a resolution. We need to have an up or down vote in the entire budget, one number that includes discretionary mandatory spending. In today's terms, that means we'd be voting on a roughly $4 trillion spending budget, not $1.2 trillion in discretionary only. Number 3, and I respectfully heard the Representative Price and his views on biennial budgeting. I think we need to take a look at it, and I'll tell you why. I'm a subcommittee chair in approps. I believe that by budgeting over a longer period of time, it can make the process and outcomes more predictable for all stakeholders. This removes some uncertainty for federal agencies and adds much-needed capacity to the Senate. I don't know if that's been talked about a lot, but one of the problems we have in the U.S. Senate is floor time. And the appropriations process we have today would consume a lot of that Senate capacity. A biennial budget actually frees up more capacity for the Senate to do the work of the people. You're much more efficient in the House than we are in the Senate. You guys get a lot better gas mileage. 4th, we need to create incentives to pass a budget. I think we should look at both carrots and sticks. If any of you have served in state legislatures, I've not, but I think 46 out of 50, conservatively, some say 48 out of 50, require a balanced budget. We should look at that for Washington, D.C. as well. But at a minimum, as we see, I know in the state of Montana, they don't get to leave town until the budget's done. And so there's an incentive there to keep members there until they actually get the budget completed. But I think we're going to have to put something in here that compels this organization, this body, to do it. I do think by moving forward in some of these ideas, we can fix this. We need to fix it. I know there have been many efforts, you know this, and failed attempts to reform our budget process. I hope this doesn't go down in history as one more failed committee that came up with recommendations and nothing was done. I sincerely believe this is the #1 reform facing Congress. I don't think there's anything more important than what you are doing right here. I think truly this is the most important work that we can be doing at the moment. We need to act. No more CRs, no more omnibuses. Failure is not an option. Thank you for holding the session today and allow me to share my thoughts.
Senator Daines, thank you very much for your testimony this morning. Our next witness hails from the state of Alabama. And we're going to provide 5 minutes of testimony from Representative Robert Aderholt. Representative Aderholt, the committee appreciates your time this morning. Look forward to your testimony. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the co-chairs for an opportunity to speak, and also to all the members. Thank you for allowing members to come and address the committee today. Let me start by saying that I welcome today's discussion and the opportunity to engage with members about the ways that we can make rule changes that improves our budget and appropriations process. The fulfillment of Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7 to responsibly oversee spending of public funds is one of the most crucial and necessary tasks that are executed by the federal government. Serving now in my 22nd year on the House Appropriations Committee, I've reviewed the process extensively. I've seen it in work over the years. And as I have served the people of the Congressional District, 4th Congressional District in Alabama. But the trend of stopgap funding bills and government shutdowns, there is, in this environment, there's a lot that we can do to ensure American people that they're receiving effective government that they deserve. The work of passing 12 individual appropriation bills through the subcommittee, through the full Appropriations Committee, and then on the floor of each chamber is a challenging process. It requires consensus and certainly a lot of hard work by a lot of people. The House Appropriations Committee has had dozens of hearings, met with administration officials to hear the budget justification. We have moved through the subcommittee process, the full committee process, with bipartisan agreements on much of the content that's in these funding bills. In recent years, the House has been able to consider and pass bills through this process despite the challenges that we have seen in the Senate. This has caused Congress, under the leadership of both Republicans and Democrats, to use combined spending packages as a way of forcing funding through the process. However, the status quo is not working, and I think that's what you're hearing from a lot of our colleagues today. The President, as you know, has promised that he will not sign another consolidated 12-bill package. In the House, we're trying to do our part to ensure that the process moves forward, that we have bills to go to conference with the Senate once they've completed their work. To ensure these bills will be considered in a timely manner, I think or I would submit that the Senate has got to strongly consider doing away with the filibuster rule on appropriation legislation. By eliminating this Senate practice on appropriation bills, the federal funding can be streamlined and this institution can get back to upholding our constitutional responsibility. The Senate's responsibility is to the people they represent and to their constitutional duty to fund the federal government, not the administrative rules that are governing their body. Even though our founding fathers gave the House authority to originate money bills through the origination clause in the Constitution, the House somehow thinks that now it is in our best interest to take a step back to the Senate internal rules, and what we have found is ourselves pre-negotiating House bills with the Senate. I believe the House should continue passing appropriation bills that reflect the will of the people. We should then present each appropriation bill for Senate consideration, and then as the House hold out for passage, so that the Senate can get to a formal conference. This conference should reflect a bipartisan approach that can reach a majority in each chamber, a simple majority and not a supermajority. If the majority party wants to filibuster and shut down the government, then that would be their prerogative. This is what I would call, and I think most of us would consider, regular order. It has worked for decades upon decades in this institution. But we have gotten away from that, and if we're going to be successful in making Washington work for the people, instead of partisan gridlock, it's going to take getting back to regular order or these basics. Let me add that one proposal which I do not think is a good idea is having a 2-year appropriation bill. I'm very concerned about the matter of oversight. The annual appropriations process allows for a relatively quick review of how agency in addressing congressional concerns. It allows the entire House and Senate to be involved in the process, in contrast to the reprogramming actions, and they do serve a legitimate process. Above all, we must remember that the legislative bodies we're representing our voters. We take money from our voters, from hardworking families, and it's very legitimate that we use both directive and be very diligent in our oversight as we turn that money over to the executive branch. And with that, I see my time is out, and I yield back.
Thank you to the gentleman from Alabama, Representative Lowy, the co-chair.
I just want to thank the gentleman from Alabama. And on an optimistic note, I'm aware, excuse me, that the Senate is moving rather quickly, working in a bipartisan way, and I'm hoping that at a time near the time they complete their work and we complete the work, the bills can be meshed in a bipartisan way, and the authorizing poison pills that have been attached to the House bills can somehow disappear, and we could all work together and have a good bipartisan process. So I just wanted to thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for letting me come before the committee.
Thank you, Representative Aderholt. Our next witness is a gentlelady from Connecticut, Elizabeth Esty, and Joint Select Committee appreciates the opportunity to hear your testimony this morning, and we will open the floor for you for 5 minutes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Lowy, for the opportunity to present some views of how I think we can improve the budgeting and appropriations process in this House. In particular, I'd like to focus on a broader principle of the breakdown of long-term decision-making and planning. I see this with great clarity as the vice-ranking member of the Transportation Committee, where we have been unable to pass major infrastructure planning. And I think the American people are largely unaware that unlike states and unlike individuals who have capital budgets, that we do not do that in the U.S. Congress. And so the normal political pressure to do short-term planning has now become, I believe, significantly aggravated by where we are with deficits and our budgeting process. So I would urge the committee, regardless of what specifics you come up with, that we should be focused on making good long-term, wise decision-making for the American people. And I think we've gotten away from that. And I think the budgeting process has now compounded that process. I think there are some things we could look at in doing that. Capital budgeting, which I know that we have had previous members of Congress who advocated for strongly, 2-year budgets. But the bottom line should be we need to empower and equip members of Congress to think about how to make those long-term decisions. The CBO plays an important role there. We've met with them and tried to solicit some ideas about what they could do by limiting them to a 10-year time window to look at and requiring a specific figure rather than ranges. I think we are limiting their ability to inform us. We know, for example, in the field of healthcare, preventive care has the most important benefits, not 10 years out, but 20, 30, 40 years out. But they are statutorily prohibited from considering those long-term benefits. When I've asked them directly about what it would take to do that, they say, for one thing, they need statutory permission to do that. But I think they would also be more comfortable if they were allowed to give ranges or confidence levels further out. You know, we have a high degree of confidence 10 years out, but in the further out years, we would expect savings, but these are more guesstimates, perhaps. I think that could help inform our debate, whereas now they're not allowed to do that whatsoever. So that can be in preventive care. Certainly that's true for infrastructure, where we are just gridlocked, and we will pay for pieces of paper in our offices, but we won't pay for replacements of bridges and roads. The American people don't get why that's happening, and part of that, frankly, is the scoring process. Makes it hard. It makes it easy to do the piece of paper and really hard to replace the bridge. So whatever ends up happening, I think we have to look at how the budgeting process can empower and inform members to be wise, to make those long-term decisions. And the budgeting process should be part of that. We know we've got gridlock on many political disagreements. But I think notions about the value of preventive care and health care, about the importance of infrastructure, we all know that. We don't need to go to school for that. So therefore, we need to take a good hard look at our budgeting and appropriations process to find out what are the current impediments to us making wiser decisions. So those were my 2 cents about how we should approach the objectives, not the specifics of how we do it, but really the touchstone of what we need to be doing. We all know that's true. The American people can't figure out why we can't get these budgets done, and I believe some of those longstanding practices or those guardrails we've set in place, in fact, have become an impediment to exactly what we thought we're supposed to be doing, and certainly what the American people believe we're supposed to be doing. Thank you very much.
Joint Select Committee appreciates your testimony this morning, Representative Esty.
Thank you.
Our next witness has just entered the room. We're going to ask the gentleman from California if he's prepared. The committee appreciates the testimony from all the members, and Representative McClintock, we're going to give you 5 minutes. The floor is yours, and thank you for being with us this morning.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. All spending originates in the House. In a very real sense, the buck starts here. The government cannot spend a single dollar unless the House says it can spend that dollar. The 1974 Budget Act gives the House a very powerful set of tools to control spending and balance the budget. For years on the House Budget Committee, I've heard it said that the budget's merely an aspirational document offering our vision of the direction the government should take. That's simply not true. The budget is an operational document, the single most important tool that we have to control spending. The problem is we don't use it. I've also heard incessantly that it's the mandatory spending that's to blame, and that's beyond our control. Well, mandatory spending is out of control, but it is a lot easier to change than discretionary spending because the reconciliation bill gets expedited consideration in the Senate. The appropriation bills do not. The budget resolution sets limits on the discretionary spending that's appropriated annually. That's about 1/3 of our budget. It also limits the mandatory spending that's set by statute. That's about 2/3 of our budget. And it gives us powerful tools to enforce both sets of limits. The problem is we don't use them. Why? Well, the first problem is on the discretionary side. Those limits are sent to the House Appropriations Committee, which cannot exceed them. The House routinely meets this responsibility. The Senate does not, because its dysfunctional cloture rule gives a minority the ability to block them. As the deadline approaches and the threat of a government shutdown looms, the appropriation bills are cast aside in favor of stopgap measures that continue the spending trajectory without serious reform. Now, that's easy to fix. Give appropriation bills the same expedited consideration in the Senate that the reconciliation bill already has. The bigger problem is on the mandatory side, and process reform is not going to fix it. The mandatory limits are supposed to be placed in reconciliation instructions that are sent to the House authorizing committees. Those committees are then required to make conforming statutory changes. If the committees fail to act, the Budget Committee can do so directly. Either way, those statutory changes go into a single reconciliation bill that bypasses cloture. But this powerful process is never used. Why? Well, because decisions on reforming mandatory spending, mainly entitlement programs, are the most difficult decisions in our fiscal policy. It's easier not to make them and blame the process. Every year, the House Budget Committee produces a budget that it claims will balance in 10 years, and it lays out proposals on how to do it. But it never places these proposals in the reconciliation instructions that transform them from promise into action. This year's budget's case in point. It promises mandatory spending reforms to balance within 10 years, but only places 5% of those reforms into reconciliation instructions that will actually change spending. In other words, we're 5% serious about balancing the budget and 95% unserious. If we were serious about the mandatory reforms, we'd put them in the reconciliation instructions and force the statutory changes necessary to make them. We would also include discretionary limits that we begin the trajectory back to balance in this year's spending. Fact is, we didn't. With all due respect, that makes this committee's work largely a fool's errand. The principal problem with the budget process is that it requires very hard decisions. Changing the process isn't going to make these decisions any easier. Whatever the process, the decisions are going to get harder and harder every year that we don't make them. Let me close with a warning. Countries that bankrupt themselves aren't around very long. Debt the size that we're now carrying ends up either as a fiscal crisis like those paralyzing Venezuela and our own territory of Puerto Rico, or as an economic crisis as the central bank buys up debt at the expense of economic growth, as we're seeing in Japan and throughout Europe. Over the past 10 years, while population has increased 26%, our revenues have more than kept pace. They've grown 29%. But spending has grown 46%. In short, it's the spending stupid. Our job is to control that spending. We have powerful tools to do so, but we have not used them. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings.
Thank the gentleman from California for his testimony this morning. Our next witness is from Illinois. Representative Bill Foster. Sir, we appreciate the opportunity to hear your testimony this morning. I speak for the entire Joint Select Committee in thanking you for your testimony, and we'll give you 5 minutes, and the floor is yours, sir.
Great. Well, good morning. I'd like to begin by thanking Co-Chair Womack and Co-Chair Lowy and the other members of the Joint Select Committee on Budget and Appropriations Process Reform for holding this Members' Day. I'm here to discuss the debt limit, which I view as the most unnecessary and disastrous risk to financial stability and the economic recovery of the last 8 years. Over the last 6 months, I've discussed this issue with various administration officials and many experts in hearings of the House Financial Services Committee and in private meetings. In the committee, Secretary Mnuchin responded that he did not support the debt limit, as a mechanism for controlling spending last year. And in February of this year, he thought that the repeal should be one option discussed in the long term. I agree with that statement, and I hope to advance repeal as one option that this committee considers. The debt limit is an artificial fig leaf over the fiscal irresponsibility in Congress. It sometimes gets referred to as being like refusing to pay for a meal after you've eaten it. On one hand, the debt limit instructs the administration not to issue debt beyond a certain point. On the other hand, Congress slashes revenue without paying for it and increases spending across the board, even on projects that do not make sense. The deficits created here inevitably trigger a crisis with the debt limit. As a result of the partisanship that's defined recent sessions of Congress, the debt limit is a self-inflicted risk that is unnecessary and obviously ineffective. Moreover, it creates a default risk that is not market-driven, complicating the calculation of risk and likely distorting pricing. If the United States ever exceeded the debt limit, results would be catastrophic for our economy and for hardworking Americans. This problem should not be a partisan issue. It is an issue that impacts middle-class families in every congressional district and unnecessarily slowed the recovery from the Great Recession. A 2013 Treasury report found that when this nation approached the debt limit without a clear path to raising it, the average mortgage in the United States increased $100 per month. We need to address our debt limit through the budget process, the tax code, and appropriations. We need to address our debt through the budget process, the tax code, and the appropriations, and not the artificial debt limit. Our economy should not endure a market-rocking event because of a partisan fight over an arbitrary number that is not related to either economic performance or to GDP. I asked Federal Reserve Chairman Powell about the size of our debt relative to aggregate household net worth, which, as many have noted, recently exceeded $100 trillion. He agreed that we have to address our debt in the long run, but that we are presently not nearing our carrying capacity. Our failure to provide adequate revenue to pay for the programs hardworking Americans need created a serious structural debt problem. Our economy is both rich and productive enough to fulfill our obligations to the most vulnerable. We can afford to ensure that Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid are available in perpetuity. I strongly believe it is a moral imperative that we do so. The debt limit does not provide fiscal discipline, but does cause market problems. There is no hypothesized credit limit that the United States of which I am aware, but it is clear that it is greater than the current debt load based on the market appetite for treasuries at low interest rates. Repeal would allow markets to impose this discipline. We should consider other mechanisms for forcing Congress to have real debates on fiscal policy. These could include changing House rules to provide for the privilege of the House for bipartisan budgets that balance, or a Queen of the Hill process that could provide for votes on either end of the political spectrum and a centrist alternative with bipartisan support. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before the Joint Select Committee, and happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
The committee appreciates your testimony this morning, Representative Foster. Thank you so much. Our next witness is a gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Westerman, representing Arkansas's 4th District. Bruce, the committee appreciates the opportunity to hear your testimony this morning. You have 5 minutes, and the time is yours, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to also thank the Joint Select Committee for hosting this session to obtain members' input on the current budget and appropriations process. As with many of you, I'm deeply troubled by current levels of federal outlays and appreciate the opportunity to share my concerns today. Federal government spending is out of control. Unlike state spending, which is generally limited to the amount of money collected from taxes, federal spending is permitted to vastly exceed income, and indeed it does. In April, the Congressional Budget Office released its annual budget and economic outlook, the 10-year economic forecast based on projected cost of current legislation. Economists at CBO predict the overall spending will reach $56.6 trillion over the 10-year period from 2018 to 2028, ultimately exceeding 23% of GDP. Due to this obscene level of spending, budget deficits will continue growing at ever-increasing rates. Altogether, deficits are likely to average 4.9% of GDP, which is significantly greater than the projected average economic growth rate of less than 4%. And as the nation's debt increases, so will interest payments. Annual interest payments are slated to reach $915 billion by 2028. That's 3.5 times what we've spent on our debt in fiscal year 2017. Deficit spending is easy. Balancing a budget is hard. It requires tough decisions that many do not wish to make and decisions that will inevitably upset certain individuals. But at some point, these decisions have to be made. We simply cannot continue spending beyond our means. I believe it is in our nation's best interest to set priorities now, while we have time to evaluate options and process decisions, instead of just waiting for the day of reckoning, unprepared with no good options when it comes. We owe it to our children and grandchildren and to all those hoping for a bright future in our country. Contrary to the assertions made of some, a plan to balance the budget within the next 10 years would not eliminate Congress's ability to respond to economic changes, natural disasters, or security threats. In fact, balancing the budget within 10 years is achievable even without slashing appropriations to government programs. We must simply just slow the rate at which our spending has been growing and is projected to grow. CBO projects that baseline spending at a year-over-year growth rate of 6 to 7% over the 10-year budget period. To balance the budget, we don't have to cut spending, we just have to slow the rate of spending growth instead of growing it at the CBO baseline. We could balance by growing at the same rate as the economy grows, at the same rate as the GDP grows, and I believe we should tie and force ourselves to control the spending growth at the same levels that the economy grows. I think that's a fair shake, and that's what the math proves that it will take to balance the budget. Regardless of how we get to that number, we have to stay below those levels. In the graduate level statistics class, I remember two sayings that the professor made that I think apply to my service in Congress. The first one was, he said that figures don't lie, but liars figure. And the second one was that numbers and people are the same. If you torture them long enough, they'll tell you anything you want to know. It's time for us to quit torturing the numbers. It's time for us to use common sense and math and look at the reality that if we continue growing government spending at the rates projected in the CBO baseline, we will never balance the budget. Let's balance the budget while we can with modest growth, not with cuts, but modest growth at the 2 to 3% range that we are seeing in our economy. We also have to get back to regular order, and I'm glad to see that the Senate is finally taking up appropriation bills. I hope we will get all those bills passed in the House, and I think it's the Budget Committee's responsibility to prepare or to force as much as we can, and if we can't force it now, we need to put policies in place to force regular order in the House and the Senate so that all these appropriation bills are debated in an open and transparent way, and so that we know what we're spending the money on, and we're not including new programs in large omnibus bills. I believe the committee has the ability to enforce this, and as a member of the House Budget Committee, I will support you in your efforts to do so, and I'm here to lend whatever resources or assistance I'm able to. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Representative Westerman, for your testimony before the Joint Select Committee this morning. Our next witness comes from Utah, Representative John Curtis. The committee is delighted to have you in front of them this morning and look forward to your testimony. You have 5 minutes, sir, and the time is yours. Turn that microphone on, if you would, please.
There we go. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Womack and Co-Chair Lowy, for holding today's hearings on reforms to Congress's budget and appropriation process. The American people are justifiably frustrated with Congress and our inability to do our most basic job, pass a budget and fund the government. I applaud the work of this Joint Select Committee for holding this critically important hearing to look at potential reforms to fix our broken budget and appropriation process. I want you to know I find myself thinking about you a lot in this committee, and I hope you feel me cheering in the background for your success. As a relative newcomer to Congress, many members of this committee likely don't know who I am, so I'd like to take a brief moment to introduce myself. I'm John Curtis. I have the great honor of representing Utah's 3rd Congressional District. Before coming to Congress last November in a special election, I was mayor of Utah's 3rd largest city, Provo, Utah, for 8 years. Like many of you, having served in local or state government, I've had to make hard decisions needed to balance a budget, especially when that involved cutting spending. I'm proud to say that as a mayor, we balanced our city's budget every single year, including my first year in 2010, when we were required to close a gap of 8% between revenues and expenses. Not only did we do it without raising taxes, but we also increased the level of services given to our residents and at the same time improved employee morale. Those who know Utah know that some of Utah's core values are fiscal responsibility and restraint. These Utah values of fiscal responsibility and restraint are best demonstrated by the fact that Utah's state constitution requires, by law, that the state and city government balance their budgets every year. To maintain a balanced budget, we rely on many good policies and restraints on lawmakers. But I'm here today to share with you only one of those practices that I believe, if adopted by the federal government, could dramatically change the quality of our budgeting process. The idea was born when a former governor threatened to veto the entire budget if the legislature didn't include her pet project. The idea is not unique to Utah, and it's not revolutionary. In fact, it's almost too simple. In Utah, we call it the baseline budget. At the first of every legislative session, the legislature adopts a baseline budget. This is largely the previous year's budget. Therefore, the default, if we fail to come to agreement, is the continuation of last year's budget. Natural inflation puts pressure on the legislative body to come up with a new budget. But while we do so, we are under no threat of a government shutdown. Think of it as a kindler and gentler continuing resolution. It allows for the important wheels of government to keep churning while we, void of pressure, study and deliberate without throwing hundreds of government responsibilities into a tailspin. I've been in Congress for only 7 months, and I've voted on 4 continuing resolutions, and I've seen 2 shutdowns. Each time I felt like a hostage with no option. As members of Congress, we were given a several hundred-page spending bill, often with only a day or 2 to consider it, and told that if we don't vote in support of the legislation, the government will likely shut down. When this happens, there is simply no way to do our jobs as promised back home. By passing a baseline budget, or essentially adopting the previous year's budget at the beginning of the legislative session, the state legislature is able to make meaningful adjustments to the spending levels for next year's budget without a threat of a government shutdown if they fail to come to an agreement. Utah is doing a lot of things right, and I believe this baseline budget process is one of many that Congress can learn from states like Utah. I strongly recommend that the Select Committee study Utah's baseline budget process and consider recommending that it be adopted in Congress's budgeting and appropriation processes moving forward. Thank you for this opportunity to testify today, and with that, I yield my time.
Thank you, Representative Curtis, for your testimony this morning. Going to move quickly to our next witness from Connecticut. Representative Jim Himes represents the 4th District of Connecticut. Representative Himes, the committee appreciates the chance to hear your testimony this morning on this very important subject, and the floor is yours, sir, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Madam Ranking Member and distinguished members who are here. I'd really like to thank you for bringing us together today to discuss an important topic at the heart of our governance: how to budget, how to raise revenue, and how to spend on a rational and fiscally sustainable path. As chair of the New Democrat Coalition, I'm proud that our forward-thinking members have been at the forefront of budget reform, looking for opportunities to plan for our future in a thoughtful, bipartisan, and rational way, which is the exact opposite of how this process has worked for the 10 years that I have been here. This is a moment of optimism for me, though a small one, because in 10 years I have finally decided that the number of people who are truly interested in fiscal responsibility in this body can be counted on one hand. My friends on the Republican side of the aisle are absolutely horrified by deficits right up until the moment there is no longer a Democratic president to blame for them. Democrats are all too often see spending as the first solution to every problem. Special interests and our constituents have their wish lists, but nobody wants to pay for those wish lists. I'm a pessimist because I did see one plan a couple of years ago that was a very tough but fair plan. I'm referring, of course, to the Simpson-Bowles budget, which came out of the super committee process. It was really, really tough, but it was fair. It protected the most vulnerable American citizens. It asked everybody to give up some of the sacred cows of their party. Yes, there were slight progressive tax increases, and yes, there were things like chained CPI, which people on my side of the aisle did not like. That proposal, which was the result of a lot of hard work and political sacrifice, received exactly 33 votes in the United States House of Representatives, less than 10% of the membership. That's where we are. That's why I'm a pessimist, but I do appreciate the committee focusing on this. The only question in my mind at this point, having given up on the idea that we are collectively going to take the hard decisions and look at our various constituents and say everybody needs to give something, my fear is that the capital markets will finally impose discipline on the United States government. So the question is, who's going to finally blow the whistle? Will it be us, or will it be the capital markets who finally define for us what it is meant to be unsustainable? Now, I'll point out that we've set ourselves up for a real problem here. When I came here 10 years ago, Admiral Mullen said the single largest threat to our national security is the debt. I was warned each and every day that we were going to see spiraling treasury rates, interest rates going up. We were on the verge of catastrophe. The exact opposite happened. Interest rates stayed low. We continued to spend in a long-term unsustainable pattern. We just got through a process of adding $2 trillion to the deficit over a 10-year period, and yet, remarkably, the capital markets don't raise a whimper. That will not remain the case. So we'll see. I actually, sadly, though I'm not temperamentally pessimistic, believe that it will finally be the capital markets defining for us what sustainability is that forces us to act. In the meantime, I just want to offer 3 ideas that I think might help the process and at least get us to a more honest process. Number 1, first, do no harm. I have seen in 10 years any number of hostage situations associated with the debt ceiling, which does absolutely no good in terms of controlling the overall amount of debt or forcing fiscal discipline. Let's get rid of the hand grenade that each party gets to use once every couple of years. It led to downgrades. It led to market insecurity. Let's get rid of it. It does absolutely no good to anybody. Number 2, let's put together a process to be honest and level with the American people on the complex nature of the problem and the big steps that we need to solve it. Again, Simpson-Bowles, now part of distant history and a very painful thing for those of us who voted for it, pointed in the direction of actually making people think about what sacrifice means and who should do that sacrifice. Third, let's plan for the long haul. Let's bring members together early to look at the far out horizon, come to a consensus, and develop a plan that can outlast the shifting partisan winds. This could include a shift to biennial budgeting, including tough allocations that genuinely last a full Congress and allow agencies to efficiently plan ahead. Again, I hope that this committee can shake this place in such a way that we do what we've been elected to do, which is to take the tough choices, to speak truth to the American people, and to preserve not just those programs which have done so much for the American people, but to keep the economy competitive and to be worthy of the people who send us here. So thank you to the committee, and I yield back my time.
Appreciate the testimony of Representative Himes this morning. Our next witness from Kansas, Roger Marshall, representing the 1st District of Kansas. Sir, we appreciate the opportunity to hear your testimony this morning. We're going to give you 5 minutes as soon as we change a name placard. If you would engage that microphone, sir, we're going to give you 5 minutes, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and certainly I don't need to preach to the choir here and explain to you the challenges before us and the inadequacy of our efforts and results since my time here. First of all, I want to just talk about solutions. My first suggestion is to consider separating the budget from the appropriations process. While it feels too much like an excuse I've heard from my own sons, having additional time to complete the annual budgeting and appropriation task would go a long way. While this city seems to live from news cycle to news cycle, I've never seen a company or organization that so often starts a year and continues working without a budget as a basic guide for the rest of their operations. While I don't like to admit the Congress is slower than we should be, there's something to be gained by recognizing this reality. Putting Congress on a two-year budget cycle allows an overarching agreement to be formed that Congress and then the work of Appropriations Committee can happen in a deliberate fashion rather than those two happening on top of each other, many times feeling like it's simultaneous to me. It seems like the budget has very little teeth to it. Next, I would talk about staggering fiscal years for appropriations bills. At first glance, I'm not a person that likes to make things more complicated, but we currently are moving from a cliff-to-cliff governance that having all 12 annual appropriations due in a single month creates. When all 12 expire at the same time and Congress gets behind the 8 ball, it's too easy to combine them into a large omnibus that leads us to passing one continuing resolution after another. Next, I would talk a little bit about the increasing involvement with the authorizing committees, and certainly I know there's many appropriators in the group and that this suggestion may not be popular, and I salute those people that are doing the best job they can under the circumstances. But the reality is, despite your best efforts to reach members through member days and the appropriation request process, non-committee members have much less involvement in the annual appropriation process. So we need to look for ways to improve that. And then finally, just to touch on entitlement programs once again. Right now, 3/4 of our federal budget is going towards these entitlement programs, and it seems like we don't have a chance with the Budget or Appropriations Committees to do anything. Certainly, I understand the entitlement programs are necessary. The retirees in my district count on knowing how much and when Social Security checks and Medicare benefits will arrive. However, the current treatment of that spending sets up failure, as there is no practical opportunity to edit or adjust the programs, even if working decades into the future. Right now, healthcare expenses are responsible for actually 28% of federal spending. We have to find ways to have tough discussions and take this challenge head on. Much of what needs to be done is outside of the congressional budget process. Things like putting consumers back in charge of their healthcare dollars, increasing transparency in supply chains, and freeing private companies to innovate. But structuring our budget process in such a way to provide additional scrutiny into where those mandatory dollars go can help us start to bend the healthcare costs down. Thank you so much for the chance to appear before the committee.
Representative Marshall, we appreciate it. The committee thanks you for your testimony here this morning. Our next witness doesn't need a lot of introduction. Been around these parts for a long time. He is authoritative in a lot of subjects regarding budgets and appropriations, having served as the overall chairman of the appropriations process in the House for 6 years, continues to serve on the Appropriations Committee as a subcommittee chair. And, sir, the Joint Select Committee appreciates the opportunity to hear your testimony this morning. So at this time, I'm going to recognize a gentleman from Somerset, Kentucky, Chairman Hal Rogers.
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Lowy,
Turn that, yeah, make sure that mic is on, and the floor is yours.
thank you for the opportunity to testify this afternoon. I've been in this body for 38 years, 35 of which has been on the Appropriations Committee. So I have a little bit of a unique perspective on the process because of that long period of time. The Congress, of course, has the power of the purse, and we're obligated to exercise that power thoughtfully, responsibly, but also regularly. During my tenure as chairman of the full committee, my top priority, as was that of Ms. Lowy, my ranking member, was returning to regular order so that members on both sides of the aisle had an opportunity to express the priorities of their congressional districts. Regular order means moving 12 bills through an open and transparent committee process and then taking the bills to the House floor for discussion and debate in an open atmosphere. In the 6 years that I was privileged to lead the committee, as a result of that openness, we drafted strong bipartisan bills. I was proud to work with Ranking Member Ms. Lowy and her predecessor, Norm Dix, to bring 138 bills to the House floor, 69 of which were ultimately enacted into law. Together, we debated over 2,100 amendments in the course of more than 550 hours on the House floor. The committee held over 650 budget and oversight hearings to ensure our tax dollars were being spent wisely. I'm pleased and grateful that Chairman Frelinghuysen has continued these important efforts, maintaining a spirit of hard work and collegiality on the committee. The primary message, Mr. Chairman, Ms. Lowy, the primary message I'd like to convey to you today is that this important task, as time-consuming and politically difficult as it may be, needs to remain an annual exercise for two primary reasons. First, Congress has a responsibility to hold federal agencies accountable to the American people through the appropriations process. Second, in the dynamic world we live in today, federal agencies need to be nimble and responsive. Their appropriations should reflect changing priorities and needs, and they need to be able to move expeditiously through reprogramming requests and the like. And that means a constant contact with the appropriators all during the year, not just every other year, not just every year, but every day. On the first point, it don't matter which party sits in the White House. In our system of checks and balances, the Congress has a duty to ensure the executive branch is responsibly spending federal resources according to federal law. And I believe that moving toward a two-year budget resolution, as we've been doing, frankly, the last few years, is a good thing. It gives the Appropriations Committee and the Congress advance notice about what the targets are going to be 2 years from now, so that we can plan for that. So I think a two-year budget resolution will go a long way to promote regular order and stability, provided it also includes annual appropriations to give you, as a member of Congress, the chance to question agency heads and the like frequently, not just once a year, but lots of times a year. So I'm grateful for the work all of you are doing on this select committee, and I hope your recommendations will move our esteemed body forward. I've noticed, Mr. Chairman, too, that since the Senate has been unwilling or unable to take up and pass the appropriations bills that we send over to them, the agencies picked up on that really quickly. When the agency head would come before our appropriating House committee, they knew that we could not pass through the Congress the bill appropriating for their committee, or for their agency. So they were very unresponsive to the House appropriators because they knew we didn't have the whip to crack. And that's true even today. So hopefully, our esteemed colleagues on the other side of the Capitol will come to their senses and allow a majority vote on going to proceed. If they want to filibuster the bill once it gets on the floor, fine and dandy. But moving to proceed on appropriations bills ought to be a majority vote. Neither body should have the authority and power to shut down the government. That's why we're here. So when the agencies that come before us to try to explain why they want an X amount of dollars and how they're going to use it, we need to be able to scare them, if you will, with the ability to pass these bills through House and Senate and make it law so that they can be responsible to us as representatives of a lot of people. So, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for convening this meeting. Thank you for letting me have a chance to say a word or two. I'll be happy to answer questions if you
Appreciate your testimony, Mr. Rogers. I'm going to yield to my distinguished co-chair, Ms. Lowy. I know she has some comments she'd like to make.
Well, first of all, it's been an honor for me to work with you for many years on the Appropriations Committee, and I appreciate your testimony, and I feel strongly that appropriations have to be dealt with every year, and certainly the Foreign Ops Subcommittee is a perfect example of changing conditions in the world. On an optimistic note, it is my understanding that in the Senate, they are working together on a bipartisan way and are moving rather quickly and getting the appropriation bills through the process. So I am always cautiously optimistic that together in a conference, we can work together in a bipartisan way and somehow make all those poison pills disappear. So I want to thank you very much. It's been an honor for me to work with you, and thank you for presenting your views with which I agree. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
I know our next witness, Dan Webster, is waiting in the wings. I just wanted to throw out one thing on the table for my friend from Kentucky, and that is when the speaker led this morning, his thesis statement was questioning whether or not anybody believed that the Senate was ever going to be able to manage and pass 12 appropriation bills in any given year through the Senate. And so that becomes a basis for a debate and a discussion about that. Now, the good news is when our Joint Select Committee first convened, we were careful not to make it a pick on the Senate program because half of our members are from the Senate, and they self-ID'd at the time that they were indeed part of the problem, that being able to manage 12 appropriation bills, and because of Senate rules, there were problems there. Do you think a biennial budget with 12 titles of appropriations every year is doable, given the fact that the Joint Select Committee is not going to have the power necessarily to impose a change? We can only advocate through legislative text some changes, but do you think that getting maybe to the motion to proceed under a simple majority would be the elixir that fixes that side of the problem?
I think so. I met yesterday and had a good long talk with the Senate Appropriations Chairman, who, as you know, the Senate now has passed a minibus of 3 bills, which we will be able to conference one of these days, hopefully. But I think the motion to proceed in the Senate should be a majority vote, just to bring it up and get it on the floor. Appropriations bills, I would prefer. If they want to do all, that's fine, but especially appropriations bills, which are a different animal. And it is the existentialism. It's whether or not we survive as a government. But I think the motion to proceed should be a majority vote. Let that bill come to the floor, and if they want to filibuster it, hey, make my day. Speak all night, the way we used to be. But I've been here a little while, and the first 25 years on this committee, it worked not like a clock, but it worked. We passed 12 bills. We went to conference on 12 bills with the Senate. There was give and take. By nature, we had to compromise to polish up a bill to be able to pass with a majority vote. So I've seen it work, and it works fine until the Senate comes up with that rule that is a monkey wrench in the cogs of government. So I would hope that that would change. Met yesterday with the President and the Cardinals on the House and the Senate Appropriations Committee, and this was one of the main points of conversation that we had, and the President was very strong. That's not even the word for it. He was really strong to the senators about changing that rule, but we found no sympathy on that side at this point in time. But I think the pressure should build, and is building, on the Senate to change an archaic rule that is preventing the government from operating. I don't get too excited about things, but I'm excited about this.
That in Kentucky basketball.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Madam. Thank all of you for doing this hard chore. And it's good to see my friend from Louisville, Kentucky, who claims to have a good basketball team over there at U of L.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate your testimony. Our next witness is Dan Webster from Florida. The Joint Select Committee Members' Day group here this morning does appreciate the time you're spending with us. We look forward to your testimony. The floor is yours, sir.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and others who are putting forth their time to listen to this hours of testimony, I'm sure. I came to talk about maybe pureness of the process more than just the minute details of the process. I believe that there is mission creep between the Budget Committee, the Appropriation Committee, and in the end, the substantive committees, the authorizers. And if you look at it closely, you'll see that the appropriators in many cases do substantive law. They do riders. They do other things, including approving appropriations for non-existent authorizations which have expired. On the other hand, the Budget Committee bleeds over into substantive law by making assumptions of things that aren't in law right now. And not only that, they also talk about the funding of those, which is the appropriation processes. That's their job, the appropriators. And if you just see that it all kind of bleeds together, and then in the end, the authorizers, in many cases, set forth numbers. And that's not their prerogative, at least in a pure system. That's the appropriators. Appropriators take whatever is existing in current law, which is policy, and to whatever degree they determine, they fund that policy. Could be zero, could be $10, it could be $1 billion, as opposed to the authorizers inserting numbers and basically making the appropriators follow suit. So that's what I'd like to talk about today. I think the easiest way to get started on the revamp is to get rid of the Budget Committee. That way, at least one of those bleeding over into the others would go away. I think it's redundant in a lot of ways. It's not nearly followed. Some years when we don't do it, we go out and promote the fact we're not doing it because it's really not needed. And other years when we need it, we do it. And it's like it either comes and goes depending on what the circumstance, and that's both parties have done that. So if you got rid of that, then the appropriators would only appropriate. They would appropriate on existing policy, whatever that policy is, and they would do it to the degree they determine and to the amount they determine or don't determine. And then on the other hand, the authorizers would not get to spend money. They could authorize something in let's say, a bridge and right-of-way area, in that you can spend money on bridges and right-of-way, but you don't necessarily put the amount down that you're going to spend. That's the appropriator's job. And so with that, the reason I would say that is I believe that if we can purify each of those areas, and the easiest one is to just get rid of one, that certainly purifies their motives and other things, I think you end up with a process at least where you're going to be able to participate at whatever level you want to, but what you know you're not going to be able to put money into a program that doesn't exist in the appropriation bill, nor by amendment could you be able to put you can't put authorized policy in an appropriation bill, nor could you put in the appropriation bill, or the appropriators cannot put policy in their particular bill. That is a summation. There's all kinds of details that would have to go through. How do you get what the overall spending levels are? How do you allocate to each of the subs and all that? I didn't go into that. I do have some ideas about that, but I just said if we start by setting it. The other is, I guess maybe the last thing, we have too many lines on a sheet of paper, all of which claim to be the starting line for the budget or appropriation. And so the baseline should be one baseline only. That way, the members, the public, everyone understands. Appropriators appropriate, the authorizers authorize, and there's one line that you start with. That's what I would say is the way to simplify the whole process.
Thank you very much for your testimony this morning. The Joint Select Committee appreciates your input.
Thank you.
All the best. We have one remaining witness, and he is the gentleman from South Carolina 5, Representative Ralph Norman. Sir, we again appreciate the chance to hear your comments this morning. We're going to give you 5 minutes, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Colonel Womack. I appreciate the time and with the committee. I hadn't been here as long as Hal Rogers or Dan Webster or Rob or a lot of you, but I just preface my prepared remarks with I don't think I have yet there's no topic that is of more concern to the people in my district than the budget, the deficit, the way we appropriate money since I've been elected, and even before then. So I would just preface my remarks. This is on the minds of the people. It's on the minds of people that put us in office. And I'm a business guy. I run a development company. But I appreciate you taking the time, and I won't need the 5 minutes. You know, I think we all agree our budget process is broken. The 1974 Congressional Budget Act laid out what our role was in the timeline for passing annual budgets and the 12 annual appropriation bills. The last time Congress passed all 12 appropriation bills was 1997. That's 21 years ago. For 6 straight years between fiscal years 2011 and 2016, not one single appropriations bill was passed on time. This isn't a Republican issue. This isn't a Democratic issue. As a business owner, as a developer, if I had not had a budget for 6 years, I would be broke. I would not be up here where I am today because you couldn't, you would not have the dollars, the company would not have the dollars to exist. So not having a budget process from a practical sense does not make sense. I firmly believe our nation cannot and will not remain solvent if we keep passing trillion-dollar omnibuses and continuing resolutions. My constituents will not allow me to vote for something like that. This is a regular order, and we must follow it. And what's amazing is the appropriation bills only cover a third of our federal spending. I would ask that we try to find solutions, those of you who are on this committee and those of us as we serve in Congress. The entitlement spending is the biggest driver of our spending problems, and I found pretty quickly up here, everybody wants to cut until their ox is gored. And the current budget process does not force lawmakers to confront fiscal and economic reality. Would a biannual budget and appropriations process work better? Would strictly voting on monetary values with no policy riders and appropriations bills alleviate the problem? Last year, we passed all 12 appropriations bills in regular order with amendments, and the Senate did not do anything. I guess I would ask, what can we do to ensure the Senate acts with implementing language to force them to act better? I don't know. All I would say is it's time for us, those of us elected officials, to start making the tough decisions with spending, entitlement reform programs. You know, we've got to start addressing these in a timely manner and go back to basics, which as a business owner, and business owners all across this country, I think, would agree with. Thank you, Colonel, for your chairmanship, and thank the committee with the steps they take will hopefully solve this problem.
I thank the gentleman from South Carolina for his testimony this morning. I'll yield to the distinguished co-chair for any last-minute comments.
Well, I just want to thank my co-chair. It's been a pleasure working with you. I appreciate all those who have submitted testimony and those who are here today, and I look forward to reviewing the information and then coming to some conclusions which may or may not be implemented. But thank you so much.
I thank the gentlelady. That completes the committee's business for today. I would like to thank all the members who shared their views before the committee. As was stated in the opening remarks, written comments already submitted will be made part of the official record. And in consultation with the co-chair, I seek unanimous consent to allow other members who may wish to input this process that were unable to be here today to have until the close of business on Monday, July 2nd for such purposes. Without objection, so ordered. And with that, the committee stands adjourned.